The axe felt like a part of his own arm, not a tool, but a cold, heavy extension of his will, forged in the same silence that had shaped him. Alan stood on the scaffold, the damp chill of a late autumn morning clinging to his thick leather apron. Below, the town of Broomsaint was a sea of upturned faces, a restless collection of coughs and shuffles held together by a shared, morbid curiosity. They needed this. They needed the sharp, clean finality of his work to affirm the solidity of their world, to see a line drawn so clearly between order and chaos, between God's law and man's sin. And they needed him, the man they would not look in the eye an hour from now, to draw it for them. The condemned knelt at the block. He was a highwayman, captured on the road to the north, a man whose face was a map of hard living and whose eyes had already surrendered to the inevitable. Alan's movements were a ritual, a grim liturgy he had learned at his father's knee, each step precise and unhurried. There was no room for hesitation, no space for a thought beyond the pure geometry of the swing. His father's greatest shame, the story whispered in taverns whenever a stranger asked about the scar on Alan's jaw, had been a shaking hand. A second blow that had turned justice into butchery and filled the square with screams of a different, more horrified kind. That memory was the whetstone on which Alan sharpened his own resolve. He would be perfect. He would be clean. He would be nothing at all. He placed his left hand on the man's shoulder, a firm, steadying weight. He felt the flicker of muscle beneath the coarse tunic, felt the final, ragged intake of breath. Alan saw the knot of sinew at the base of the neck, the precise point where life nested, vulnerable and exposed. His world narrowed to that single, fleshy target. He raised the axe. It caught the gray morning light, a sliver of terrifying grace against the bruised sky. And then, with a controlled exhalation, it fell. There was a sound, a wet, definitive thud that the crowd absorbed with a collective, sucking gasp. It was done. The line was drawn. Justice, such as it was in this misty, God-fearing town, had been served. He did not look at the result, not for long. He was the blade, not the judge. With practiced, methodical motions, he wiped the steel on a waiting cloth, his face a mask of detached professionalism. The whispers below began to change, the tension breaking, replaced by a low hum of chatter. Soon they would disperse, back to their bakeries and their fields, their souls cleansed by proxy. They would leave him alone on the platform with the silence and the faint, coppery scent that clung to the porous wood of the block. He was the town's ghost, visible only when death was summoned, and expected to vanish the moment it was gone. The walk back was its own kind of penance. As he descended the scaffold steps, the crowd parted before him, a human sea receding from a cursed shore. No one touched him. Mothers pulled their children close, hiding their faces in their skirts as if his very shadow could curdle the milk in their breasts. Men who had been shouting for blood only moments before now studied the cobblestones with intense interest, their shoulders hunched. He carried his axe at his side, its polished head gleaming. It was less a tool than a scepter of his isolation. He needed to buy salt and a new whetstone. The market was a necessary torment. The square, which had been a theater of death, was now slowly reverting to a place of commerce. The smell of blood was being replaced by the scent of baking bread and roasting meat, but for Alan, the iron tang lingered. He approached the stall of a stout merchant named Gerard, a man whose hands were perpetually dusted with flour. Alan placed 2 coins on the rough wood of the counter. "A loaf," he said, his voice quiet, unused. Gerard's face, usually jovial, tightened. He did not look at Alan. His eyes were fixed on the coins, as if they were live coals. He took a loaf from his basket, wrapped it quickly in a piece of cloth, and pushed it across the counter, stopping a good foot from Alan's reach. He then used a small pair of iron tongs to pick up the coins, dropping them into a separate wooden bowl. Not into the leather pouch where his other earnings went. The transaction was complete, but no exchange had truly been made. There was no shared pleasantry, no nod of thanks. There was only the service, rendered and paid for, a sterile and silent contract between the town and its unclean necessity. He left the market, the bread under his arm feeling as heavy as a stone. He was known by all, yet he knew no one. He was the final solution to their problems, the walking embodiment of their justice, and for that, he was utterly, completely alone. His hut stood beyond the northern gate, nestled against the damp woods as if the town itself were trying to push it away into the misty, ancient forest. It was a place of deep shadows and the perpetual smell of pine and wet earth, a world away from the crowded, judgmental streets of Brumsaint. The town walls were a physical manifestation of the barrier that separated him from the rest of humanity. He was close enough to serve, but far enough to be forgotten. Inside, the only warmth came from a small, smoky hearth and the life he breathed into pieces of scrap wood. On a rough-hewn shelf above his cot sat a silent flock of birds, each one carved from pine or oak with a startling, delicate precision that belied the callous strength of his hands. A sparrow with its head cocked as if listening for a distant sound, a finch with wings half unfurled in the moment before flight, a swallow captured mid-swoop, its body an elegant arc of motion. He never carved the faces. The heads were always left smooth, featureless, and anonymous. To give them eyes would be to give them a soul, to grant them a window onto the world. He felt he had no right to create what he was so often required to take away. This secret craft was his only solace. The only act in his life that was purely his own. His father had beaten the skill of the axe into him, but the art of the knife he had discovered for himself, a quiet rebellion of creation against a life of prescribed destruction. When he held the small block of wood and the whittling knife, his hands, the same hands that gripped the axe helve, became instruments of grace. He would lose himself for hours. The scrape of the blade on wood the only sound, his mind blessedly empty of everything but the emerging shape of a wing, the gentle curve of a breast. These birds were also his only currency in a world that often refused his coin. Once a week, on the evening of the third day, he would walk a winding, little-used path deep into the forest, to a small clearing where Alara, the herbalist, lived in a cottage woven from willow and thatch. She, like him, occupied the gray spaces at the edge of the world. She did not belong to the town, but to the woods, to the rhythm of seasons and the quiet language of roots and leaves. The townspeople sought her out in hushed desperation when their children had fevers the physician could not break or their own bodies ached with pains for which the priest had no prayer, but they spoke of her in wary whispers. They called her a healer, but the word was often tinged with the shadow of another, witch. Their ritual was always the same, a silent, reverent exchange. He would place a newly carved bird on a large, mossy stone that marked the boundary of her clearing. Then, he would retreat into the shadows of the trees and wait. She would emerge from her cottage, a small, resilient figure with dark, braided hair and dirt always under her fingernails. She moved with a quiet purpose, her calm, knowing eyes missing nothing. She would pick up the bird, turning it over in her hands, a faint, genuine smile touching her lips. Then she would place a small, cloth-wrapped bundle in its place. Herbs for his sleep. Chamomile, lavender, and valerian root to quiet the ghosts that haunted his nights. The ghosts of the men whose last, shuddering breath he had felt on his hands. Ilara was the only person in the world who did not flinch from his gaze. When she looked at him, he felt that she saw not the executioner, but the man whose hands could create something so fragile and beautiful. Their first fumbling exchange of words had happened months ago, on a day he brought her a carving of a wren. "It has no eyes," she had said, her voice soft as moss. Alan had frozen, startled. I do not know how to make them." It was a lie, but it was the only defense he had. She had looked from the bird to his face. Her gaze direct and unpiling. "I think you do," she had replied gently. "You are simply afraid of what they will see." They rarely spoke after that, but the words hung in the space between them, a fragile thread of understanding. In her presence, for a few fleeting moments, he was not the town's blade. He was just Alan, a man who carved birds. He would take the herbs, and without looking back, retreat to his hut. The scent of the forest, of pine, and chamomile, and damp earth, a temporary balm against the permanent scent of iron in his soul. This fragile piece, however, was a luxury the world would not long afford. The shadow of Father Matthew had been growing over Broomsaint for months, a creeping chill that had nothing to do with the changing seasons. He was a new kind of priest, not a humble shepherd content to tend his flock, but a forge master of faith, hammering the town's anxieties into a rigid, righteous steel. He had arrived a year prior, a younger son of a minor noble house from the south, a man with a gaunt, severe face and eyes that burned with a terrifying, unblinking certainty. He saw sin in every shadow and weakness in every joy. The town, still raw with the memory of the great pestilence that had swept through a generation before, was fertile ground for his brand of fear. The plague had taken so many, so quickly, leaving behind a deep-seated terror of the unseen, a frantic need for explanations, for blame. They craved order, a strong hand to protect them from the darkness that could steal a life overnight, and Matthew was more than willing to provide it. His sermons were not gentle reassurances of God's love, they were thunderous condemnations of the devil's work. He spoke of a hidden corruption, a rot within the community that needed to be found and carved out with the holy fire of penitence. Alan had stood at the back of the church during one such sermon, in the small, designated space near the door where he was permitted to stand but not to kneel among the congregation. The air was thick with the scent of incense and fear. "The enemy does not sleep," Matthew's voice thundered, echoing off the cold stone walls and vaulted ceiling. "He walks among you, disguised as your neighbor. He whispers his poison in the guise of folk remedies and ancient traditions that mock the authority of God and His church. You must be vigilant. You must look into the hearts of your fellows and root out the darkness wherever you find it." When he spoke, his gaze swept the crowd, and for a moment, it landed on Alan. There was no recognition in the priest's eyes, only a cold assessment, the look a man gives a tool he may soon have cause to use. Alan felt a cold premonition then, a sense that Matthew's righteousness was a hungry thing, and sooner or later, it would need to be fed. The moment came on a sweltering, breathless afternoon in late summer, when the air itself seemed sick and stagnant. The only son of the Baron de Courcy, a pale, sickly boy of 7 years, had taken a fever. The town's physician, a nervous man named Anselm whose knowledge was limited to bleeding charts and the application of leeches, had been summoned. For 2 days he plied his trade, but the boy only grew worse, his small body racked with convulsions, his breath coming in shallow, rasping pants. In desperation, her faith in medicine exhausted, the Baroness had sent a servant to the one person left to turn to. She had sent for Ilara. Alan knew this because he had seen her small, resilient figure hurrying towards the town gates, her woven bag of herbs clutched in her hand. He had been checking the timbers of the gallows, a routine task, and had watched her go with a knot of deep unease in his stomach. He knew the Baron's son was frail. The boy had been born weak and had never thrived. Ilara was being asked to mend something that had been broken from the start. It was a fool's errand, a trap laid by hope itself. 2 days later, the funeral bell began to toll, its slow, mournful count settling over Broomsaint like a shroud. The Baron's son was dead. Beneath the performance of grief, something else was stirring, a poison far more virulent than any fever. Alan heard it in the fearful whispers at the well, the dark, angry murmurs in the tavern. Father Matthew had found his sacrifice. The priest moved through the town like a phantom, his black cassock a whisper of death, his words a balm of blame for the grieving parents. He did not speak of a weak constitution or a summer sickness. He spoke of a curse. The following Sunday, the church was packed to the doors. The air was electric with anticipation. Father Matthew mounted the pulpit, his gaunt face a mask of righteous fury. He let the silence hang for a long moment, his burning eyes sweeping over his flock. "A wolf has been among our sheep," he began, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "An agent of the devil, cloaked in the false kindness of a healer, who deals in poultices and potions, who turns the gifts of God's own earth into instruments of death." He paused, letting the words sink in. The Baron's child was not taken by a simple illness. His innocent soul was stolen by a witch. He did not need to say her name. A low, Ugly sound went through the crowd, a growl of shared conviction. Ilara. The woman of the woods. The outsider. The one who lived by rules other than their own. The poison took hold, twisting their fear and grief into a singular, hateful certainty. She was the source of their misfortune, the reason for their suffering. In her, they found a simple answer to the terrifying randomness of death. By the time the service ended, the verdict had already been passed in the hearts of the people. The official trial would be a mere formality, a piece of theater to legitimize a foregone conclusion. Alan stood in his usual place at the back, his hand resting on the cold stone of the wall. He listened as the priest's words turned Ilara's kindness into cunning, her knowledge into a dark art. He watched as the faces of the people he served, the baker, the blacksmith, the weaver, hardened into the uniform mask of a mob. And he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, where this would lead. It would lead to the scaffold. It would lead to him. The official order arrived the next day. It was delivered not by a trembling young guard, but by the captain of the Baron's household guard himself, a hard-faced man named Renaud whose armor was polished to a mirror sheen. He did not approach Alan's hut, but stood at the edge of the clearing, as if the very ground around it were contaminated. He read the decree aloud, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. By order of Baron Philippe de Courcy, and with the full sanction of the Holy Church, the woman known as Ilara has been tried and found guilty of the crime of witchcraft and commerce with demons. For her sins against God and man, she is condemned to die by hanging. The sentence is to be carried out in 3 days' time, at midday. Renaud then rolled the parchment, tucked it into his belt, and looked directly at Alan for the first time. His eyes were cold and commanding. The executioner of Brumsaint is hereby ordered to prepare the gallows and carry out the sentence. See that it is done without error. He did not wait for a reply. He simply turned on his heel and strode back towards the safety of the town walls, leaving the words to hang in the damp air. Alan stood motionless for a long time, the captain's voice echoing in his ears. Without error, the words were both a command and a threat. His reputation for flawless, dispassionate efficiency was the only thing that afforded him a sliver of protection in this world. It was the reason the Baron employed him and the reason the town tolerated him. A flawed executioner was a liability, an object of ridicule and, ultimately, disposable. He walked to the gallows, which stood stark and lonely in the field between his hut and the town walls. It was a simple, brutal structure of thick oak beams, weathered gray by years of sun and rain. He had maintained it his entire life, oiling the trapdoor mechanism, checking the integrity of the wood, replacing the rope whenever it showed signs of fraying. It was his work, his inheritance. But now, as he looked at it, he did not see a tool of justice. He saw a weapon aimed at the only flicker of warmth in his cold, silent world. His hands, usually so steady, felt alien and clumsy as he began his work. He ran his palm over the main crossbeam, feeling the rough grain of the wood. Every scrape of the new rope he began to rig, every creak of the trapdoor's oiled hinges, was an accusation. He felt as though he were building his own tomb. The pouch of herbs in his pocket, Ilara's last gift, seemed to weigh more than his axe. He took it out, the rough cloth soft against his calloused fingers. He brought it to his face, inhaling the scent of chamomile and the forest. It was the smell of a life he could never have, a life of quiet peace, now condemned to be extinguished by his own hands. That night, sleep was impossible. He did not even try to use the herbs. He did not want to sleep. He wanted to feel the full, unblunted edge of the horror that was coming. He lay on his straw mattress, staring into the darkness, but his mind was filled with light, the searing light of Matthew's fanaticism, the cold glint of Renaud's eyes, the gentle flame of Ilara's quiet dignity. The ghosts that usually visited him, the featureless faces of the men from his past, were absent. In their place was only one face, one he could picture with perfect, agonizing clarity. And in her eyes, he saw not fear, but a terrible, unshakable pity. Pity for him. He had one privilege his station afforded him, access to the condemned. It was his duty, and his right, to check on their physical state, to ensure they were fit to meet their end. It was a cruel formality, but one he now clung to as a final, desperate chance. He needed to see her. He needed to understand. The night before the execution, he lit a torch and walked to the town dungeon. The air grew colder, thicker, as he descended the stone steps beneath the town hall. It was a place of damp, despair, and the lingering smell of human misery. The jailer, a portly man with a ring of keys that jangled like chains, grunted at the sight of him and shuffled ahead to unlock the heavy door to the lower cells. Elara was in the smallest cell at the very end of the corridor, a space reserved for the most reviled. She was chained to the wall, a single iron cuff around her wrist. The straw on the floor was thin and damp. She was thinner, paler in the flickering torchlight, but when she lifted her head, her eyes were as clear and steady as ever. There was no terror in them, only a deep, bone-weary sadness. "Alan," she said, her voice a quiet rasp. He had never heard her speak his name before. It sounded strange, a word from another language, unsuited to this place. He stood before the bars, the torchlight casting his long, distorted shadow over her. He didn't know what to say. He had come with no plan, only a hollow ache in his chest. "I'm sorry," was a useless phrase. "I have no choice," was a lie he was beginning to choke on. "You are a carver of birds," she said, her voice soft but unwavering. "Your hands know how to make things whole, not how to break them. This is not who you are." "It is what I am," he managed, his own voice sounding hollow and distant in the small, damp space. "It is the only thing I am." "No," she shook her head, a small, defiant motion that rattled her chain. "That is only the mask they have given you. The one you have been forced to wear because you were strong enough to bear it." She reached a hand through the bars, her fingers uncurling. In her palm lay a small, tightly wrapped pouch, identical to the ones she always gave him. She must have had it on her when they took her. "For your sleep," she whispered. "For after. Sleep without ghosts, Alan. Just this once." He did not take it. He could not. His hands, the hands that were being commanded to take her life, he could not let them touch this final, impossible act of kindness. He simply stood there, a statue of misery, until the jailer's impatient footsteps echoed down the corridor, signaling the end of his time. As he turned to leave, her voice followed him, a final, quiet arrow aimed at the very heart of his resolve. "Even a caged bird," she said, her voice barely a whisper but as clear as a bell, "can be carved from free wood." He walked back to his hut under a sky thick with unshed rain. The town was asleep, shrouded in a misty silence that felt heavier than sound. Her words echoed in his mind, chipping away at the stone walls he had built around his soul over a lifetime of isolation. This is not who you are. For his entire life, his identity had been a simple, brutal equation: he was the executioner. His purpose was to serve the town's justice, his skill was in the clean, efficient taking of life. He had found a strange, bleak pride in his perfection, a way to control the one part of his life that was his to command. To be a good executioner, to be flawless and without error, was his only virtue. But Elara's kindness had introduced a new, impossible variable into this grim arithmetic. She had seen something else in him. The carver of birds. The man with gentle hands. She had looked at the monster and seen a man. And now, the town, in its blind fear and manipulated hatred, was asking him to destroy the only person who had ever done so. He entered his hut and barred the door, though he knew there was no one in Broomsaint who would willingly cross his threshold. The fire in the hearth had died down to glowing embers. He sat at his small, rough table, the tools of his other trade laid out before him. A block of soft pine. A set of small, sharp whittling knives. He picked up the wood. He had intended to carve a hawk, something fierce and free, a creature of the open sky. But his hands would not obey. He could only see the gallows, the rope, Elara's face, her eyes filled not with fear for herself, but with pity for him. He remembered his father. He remembered the night after the botched execution, the night the highwayman had not died cleanly. His father had sat in this very hut, at this very table, his great, powerful hands shaking so violently he could not lift a cup of ale to his lips. He had not spoken a word, just stared into the fire, but Alan, only a boy of 12 then, had seen the look in his eyes. It was not guilt, not remorse for the man who had suffered. It was a profound, bottomless shame. The shame of failure. The shame of being seen by the town not as a fearsome instrument of justice, but as a clumsy, incompetent butcher. His father had drunk himself into a stupor that night, and for a week after, he had been unable to hold his axe steady. The memory was seared into Alan's mind. He had sworn to himself then that he would never be his father. He would be better. He would be perfect. My father's shame was a shaking hand, Alan thought, the idea forming with a terrible, crystalline clarity. My shame would be a steady one. To kill Alara with the same cold precision he had always prided himself on would not be a victory of control. It would be the ultimate act of surrender. It would be the final, irrevocable admission that he was nothing more than the tool they believed him to be. An axe with legs. A thing without a soul. It would be to take the small, fragile humanity she had seen in him and crush it with his own 2 hands. He stared at the uncarved wood. Free wood. The choice was not between duty and mercy. It was between 2 kinds of death. A death of the soul, standing on the scaffold tomorrow, becoming the perfect monster they demanded. Or a death of the body, by defying the world that had unmade him. For the first time in his 28 years, the path was not laid out before him like a road to the block. For the first time, he had to choose. The silence of the hut deepened. No longer empty, but filled with the immense, terrifying weight of a life waiting to be decided. He picked up one of his sharpest knives. He did not touch the pine block meant for the hawk. Instead, he reached for a small, discarded piece of oak, a wood as hard and resilient as the woman in the cell. And as the first fat drops of rain began to speckle the packed dirt outside his window, he began to carve. Not a bird this time. Something else. Something for tomorrow. The day of the execution dawned gray and oppressive. A fine mist hung in the air, blurring the edges of the world and clinging to everything with a damp, cold touch that felt like death's own sweat. The town square was a churning mass of bodies, a grim pilgrimage gathered for a holy spectacle. The people of Brumsaint huddled together in the damp chill, their faces a disturbing mixture of fear, excitement, and grim piety. They had come to see the witch hang. The method had been Father Matthew's specific decree. Hanging was a slower, more public spectacle than the axe. A better lesson. A better show. Alan moved through the morning like a man in a dream, his actions detached from the turmoil in his soul. He checked the gallows one last time, testing the trapdoor's release, coiling the rope with an expert's touch. His hands were perfectly steady. His face was a blank canvas, a mask of utter neutrality that revealed nothing of the storm that raged within him. He was playing his part, the final act of a performance he had been rehearsing his entire life. The silent, efficient executioner. He needed them to believe it, right up until the last possible moment. When the guards brought Alara from the dungeon to the foot of the scaffold, a low, ugly growl rippled through the crowd. They pushed and shoved for a better view, their eyes hungry. She did not look at them. She walked with a quiet, resolute dignity, her head held high, her gaze fixed on the gray, weeping sky above. Her chains rattled with each step, the only sound she made. Her resilience was a stark, noble contrast to the jeering, fearful faces around her. She looked like a captive queen, and they a pack of baying hounds. Alan met her at the top of the steps, his customary place. His eyes met hers for a fraction of a second. In that fleeting glance, an entire world of understanding passed between them. He saw no blame in her eyes, no fear, only a deep, sorrowful acceptance. And she saw something new in his. Not the cold emptiness of the executioner, but the hard, brittle glint of a decision forged in the fires of a dark night. She gave the slightest of nods, a gesture so small no one else could have seen it. Father Matthew stood at the base of the gallows, his arms crossed over his thin chest, his gaunt face alight with a triumphant, holy righteousness. He was the maestro of this grim orchestra, and the final, cleansing crescendo was at hand. He gave a sharp, imperious nod to Alan. The time had come. Alan began the ritual. His movements measured and deliberate. He took the thick hemp rope, its rough fibers coarse and familiar against his skin. He fashioned the noose, the 13 coils, a superstition he had always adhered to without thought. Today, each coil felt like a link in a chain he was about to break, binding him to a fate he now refused. He approached Alara from behind. The crowd grew silent, a collective intake of breath. This was the moment they had been waiting for. The culmination of their fear, the release of their hatred. He lifted the noose. He could feel the warmth radiating from her skin, could smell the faint, clean scent of crushed herbs, rosemary and thyme, that still clung to her clothes, a defiant scent of the forest in this place of urban decay. He hesitated for a heartbeat, a pause so small only he could feel it, a final breath before the plunge. He thought of the birds on his shelf, their silent, unfinished faces. He thought of her voice in the darkness of the cell. "This is not who you are." He slipped the noose over her head, letting it rest loosely on her shoulders like a grim necklace. He stepped back, his position placing him directly between her and the lever that would release the trapdoor. The crowd leaned forward. A single, many-headed beast, hungry for the end. Matthew's thin lips curled into a smile of pure, sanctified victory. "Let this be a lesson to all," the priest's voice boomed across the square, a powerful, carrying tone honed by years of practice. "Let the fate of this which be a warning to all who would stray from God's holy light and traffic with the devil. Do your duty, executioner. Send this corrupted soul back to the hell from which it came." Alan looked not at the priest, but out at the crowd. He saw their faces, eager for this violence, desperate to watch a woman die so they could feel safe again for a little while. They were the same people who spat when he passed, who refused his coin, who taught their children to fear his very name. And yet, for his entire life, he had served them. He had been their monster, their necessary evil, their sin-eater. No more. He reached down. But his hand went not to the oiled wooden lever. It went to his right boot, where a small, wickedly sharp skinning knife was tucked away, its handle smooth against his palm. It was a tool for animals, not for men. In one fluid, impossibly fast motion, he drew the blade. Before anyone, the guards on the platform, the priest below, the crowd beyond, could register his intent, he sliced upwards through the thick rope just above Alara's neck. The severed ends fell harmlessly to her sides. A collective gasp, sharp and sudden as a blade itself, went through the crowd. It was a sound of pure, uncomprehending shock. Father Matthew's face, a moment before alight with triumph, contorted into a mask of disbelief and fury. "What is the meaning of this? Treason! Guards, seize him!" he shrieked, his voice cracking with rage. Alan ignored him. He turned to Alara. And for the first time, she saw his face unobscured by the shadow of his duty. His eyes were blazing with a life no one in Broomsaint had ever seen in them before. "Go," he said, his voice low and urgent, a harsh command. "To the alley behind the cooper's shop. To the forest. Now." Then he turned back to the crowd, to the two guards on the scaffold with him who were just beginning to recover from their shock, their hands moving uncertainly towards the hilts of their swords. He needed to buy her more than a few seconds. He needed to give them a target so terrifying, so unexpected, that they would forget all about the woman. He needed to become a monster of a different kind. With his other hand, he seized the handle of his great two-handed executioner's axe, which rested against the gallows frame. It was heavy, perfectly balanced, an object of ultimate terror. With a roar that seemed to tear itself from the very depths of his soul, a sound of 28 years of enforced silence breaking at once, he swung it. Not at a person. At the gallows itself. The massive, polished steel head bit deep into the main upright support beam of the structure. The old oak groaned, splintered, and shrieked in protest. The entire scaffold shuddered. He wrenched the axe free, wood chips flying, and swung again, and again, each blow a negation of his entire life, a furious, violent act of uncreation. "This town will have no more of my hands for its sins," he yelled, his voice raw and powerful, carrying over the panicked shouts of the crowd. He pointed the axe towards Matthew, its edge dripping with sawdust and rainwater instead of blood. "Her only crime was kindness. A crime none of you would understand." The crowd recoiled, not in righteousness now, but in primal fear. They were afraid of him, not as the impassive executioner, but as a man. The madman on the scaffold, destroying the very symbol of their order and their safety. The distraction was total. In the ensuing chaos, as the guards on the platform stumbled back from the wild swings of the axe and the guards below tried to push through the panicked mob, no one saw the small, slight figure of Alara slip off the back of the platform, melting into the screaming, surging crowd and disappearing down the narrow, muddy alley that led towards the river and the woods beyond. Alan saw it, though. A flicker of movement at the edge of his vision, a flash of her dark cloak against the grey stone. A bird taking flight. It was enough. The guards were on him then, their courage returning as a group. They swarmed up the steps, their swords and halberds jabbing. He did not try to fight them off. He dropped the axe. It clattered onto the wooden platform, its purpose served. His rebellion was over. A searing pain erupted in his side as a blade found its mark, then another in his shoulder. He fell to his knees, not from the wounds, but from the sudden, crushing weight of a life lived and a choice finally made. As they dragged him down the steps, the world turning into a dizzying smear of grey sky and shouting faces, he felt not pain, nor fear, but a strange, quiet sense of peace. The cage was broken. They threw him into the same cell that had held Alara. The fall onto the cold, damp stone sent a jolt of agony through his body, and for a moment, the darkness behind his eyes swirled with red. He lay on the hard floor. The thin straw scratchy and foul against his cheek, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. The pain from his wounds was a hot, insistent fire, one in his side that felt deep and treacherous, and another across his shoulder where a halberd had sliced through leather and flesh. But beneath the pain, there was a profound stillness he had never known. The ghosts were gone. His life, which had been a long, straight, unalterable road leading to this inevitable point, had taken a single, glorious, hairpin turn. He had not saved himself, he had known from the moment he picked up the carving knife the night before that his own life was forfeit. But he had saved the one thing that had made his own life bearable. He had traded his bleak, empty future for her freedom. It was the only bargain he had ever made. And it was a good one. Hours passed. The torch in the corridor guttered and died, plunging the dungeon into a near-total blackness, broken only by a sliver of grey light from a high, barred window. He drifted in and out of consciousness, his mind a feverish landscape. He dreamed not of executions, but of a forest floor, dappled with sunlight. He smelled pine and damp earth. He saw a flash of wings. Not wood this time, but real, living feathers. A key scraped in the lock. The heavy door groaned open. The sudden light of a lantern made him flinch. Heavy footsteps approached his cell, not the shuffling gait of the jailer, but the firm, deliberate stride of authority. The cell door was unbarred, and a figure stepped inside, holding the lantern high. It was Father Matthew. The priest's face was a pale, taut mask of fury. The public spectacle of his righteousness had been shattered, his authority humiliated by the very tool he had sought to wield. He stood over Alan, his shadow consuming the small cell. "You," Matthew hissed, his voice trembling with a rage that stripped away his holy veneer, revealing the raw ambition and pride beneath. "You filth. You soulless animal. Do you have any idea what you have done?" Alan pushed himself up slowly, painfully, to a sitting position against the cold stone wall. He looked up at the priest, his own face calm, his breathing shallow. The fear he had lived with his entire life, fear of his father, fear of failure, fear of the town's revulsion, was gone. He had faced the worst, and chosen it. There was nothing left for this man to threaten him with. "I have done my duty," Alan said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Your duty?" Matthew scoffed, his voice rising. "Your duty was to obey. To be the instrument of God's justice. You have consorted with a witch. You have defied the church and the baron. You have spit in the face of God." "The God you speak of, Father," Alan said, a strange clarity cutting through the pain, "is he the one who craves the blood of the innocent to suit the fears of the ignorant?" Matthew's face went white. He raised a hand as if to strike Alan. Then caught himself, his fingers curling into a tight fist. "You are a dead man. The Baron has already decreed it. You will be broken on the wheel. You will beg for the death that you denied your cursed witch." Alan met the priest's burning gaze without flinching. "Then I will die," he said simply. "But I will die a man. Not your tool. Not their monster. And you, Father, you will have to find another pair of hands to do your dirty work. But they will know. The whole town will know that your holy justice was denied by the executioner himself. They will whisper. They will doubt. Your perfect, righteous world has a crack in it now. And it was made by me." For the first time, Matthew seemed at a loss for words. He stared at the broken, bleeding man before him, a man who should have been begging for his life, but who instead looked at him with something akin to pity. The priest saw that his threats were meaningless. He had lost. He had tried to break the executioner, but had only succeeded in freeing the man. With a strangled cry of pure frustration, Matthew turned and stormed out of the cell, slamming the barred door behind him, his footsteps echoing in retreat down the corridor. Alan let his head fall back against the wall, a faint, painful smile touching his lips. He had won the only victory that mattered. He wasn't sure how much longer he was there. Time had become a fluid thing, measured in the throbbing of his wounds and the slow crawl of the gray light across the far wall. At some point, the young guard, the one who had delivered the order and had been unable to meet his eyes, came into the cell. He did not speak, but he left a wooden cup of water and a small, hard piece of bread. And something else. Tucked into the bread was a small sliver of oak and the smallest of Alan's whittling knives. The boy's eyes were wide with fear and a strange, grudging respect. He backed out of the cell without a word. With trembling, clumsy fingers, Alan picked up the wood and the knife. His grand, defiant gestures were done. All that was left was this one small, quiet act. He began to carve. Not a swift, elegant swallow or a watchful sparrow. He carved the simplest of shapes, a rough, palm-sized bird. And when he was done, when the shape was complete, he did something he had never done before. He took the point of the knife and, with two small, deliberate twists, he gave the bird an eye. Then another. He looked at it, this small, seeing thing in his hand. He had created a life. However humble, that could look back at him. He heard the heavy footsteps returning down the corridor. This time, there were more of them. The final summons. He closed his hand around the small wooden bird, its sharp edges pressing into his palm. He closed his eyes. The ghosts were gone. The nightmares were silent. His mind was quiet, clear. He thought of the forest, the smell of pine and damp earth. He thought of a woman, running, her feet sure on the forest floor, the green canopy closing above her like a protective hand. The cell door creaked open. He did not need to see who was coming. He had already seen everything that mattered. His last conscious thought was not of the axe, or the block, or the coming wheel. It was a simple, clear image, held in the quiet stillness of his liberated mind. A bird, carved from free wood, its new eyes open to a vast, gray, and open sky. 1 year later, in a small, nameless village many leagues to the south, a village nestled in the deep woods far from any baron's reach, a traveling merchant sought shelter from an early winter storm. He was directed to a small cottage on the edge of the woods, where a quiet woman with calm, knowing eyes lived. She gave him a hot broth that soothed the ache in his bones and sold him a salve for his horses. Saddle sores that worked better than anything he had ever bought in a city market. As he was leaving, his curiosity got the better of him. "You have a great skill with herbs, mistress," he said. "What is your name? So I may tell others where to find you." The woman looked up from the herbs she was grinding, a faint, sad smile touching her lips. She simply shook her head. On the rough-hewn mantel above her small hearth, there sat a single, crudely carved wooden bird. It was a simple thing, lacking the grace of a master carver, but unlike the others that a traveler might have seen in a far-off town, this one had eyes. And they seemed to be watching over her. Story 2. In the silent, air-conditioned chill of the Longton Group's 88th floor boardroom, power had a distinct sound, the subtle, frictionless slide of a Mont-Blanc pen across a single sheet of paper. It was the only sound Lin Jianjun allowed as he made a single, dismissive note, his face a mask of avuncular disappointment. The presentation, Lin Wei's presentation, was over. "Brilliant, Wei," Jianjun said, the word brilliant curdling into an insult. He beamed at the board members, a dozen silver-haired men arranged around the vast obsidian table. A truly academic exercise. Perhaps something for a university journal. Lin Wei stood before them. A slim, severe figure in a dark silk suit that seemed to absorb the light. She did not flinch. She had anticipated this. Her presentation, a revolutionary AI-driven logistics network named Detong, Great Harmony, was designed to save the sprawling conglomerate billions. It was also designed to render the crony-filled subsidiaries her uncle controlled obsolete. She knew which part he had focused on. "With respect, Uncle," she began, her voice as cool and level as the glass table between them, "the projections are based on hard data, not academia. A 22% efficiency increase in the first 3 years. Projections," Jianjun chuckled, a sound like stones grinding together. "My dear niece, Longton was not built on projections. It was built on stone and steel, on relationships and respect for our ways." He gestured around the room. At the faces of men who owed their fortunes to her father, and by extension, to him, the keeper of the old ways. "It is too risky. Too disruptive." The word hung in the air, disruptive. It was a condemnation. In the world of Longton, a world built on the Confucian bedrock of order and hierarchy, disruption was a sin. The board members nodded in slow, practiced unison. The verdict was delivered without a vote. Wei inclined her head in a gesture of perfect, filial submission. "I understand, Director Lin." She gathered her tablet, her movements economical and precise. Inside her, a cold, clean fury was coiling, but her face was a placid lake. As she walked toward the door, she could feel their eyes on her back, the pity, the condescension. The girl who played with numbers. The daughter who would never be a son. That night, the call came. It was Secretary May. Her father's longtime assistant, her voice stripped of its usual unflappable calm. "Wei Xiaojie," she said, using the formal honorific for young miss, "it's the chairman. A stroke. He's at the Shanghai Huashan Hospital." The world tilted on its axis. Wei drove through the neon-drenched canyons of Lujiazui, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. Her father, Lin Jisheng, was more than her father. He was the sun around which the entire Longting system orbited. A force of nature, a titan of Chinese industry. To see him lying in a sterile white bed, a constellation of tubes and wires tethering him to the living world, was to see a monument fall. He was alive, the doctors said, but the stroke had been massive. He was non-communicative. A living ghost. As she stood by his bedside, tracing the lines on the back of her hand with her thumbnail, she wasn't just grieving for her father. She was calculating. A power vacuum is not an empty space. It is a vortex. And she knew, with absolute certainty, that her uncle was already moving to fill it. The dynasty was shattered. The war had begun. The emergency board meeting was called less than 48 hours later. Jianjun, dressed in somber gray, played the part of the grieving, responsible brother perfectly. Our family, our company, faces its greatest crisis, he announced, his voice resonating with false gravity. The chairman, my beloved brother, needs time to heal. In his absence, we need stability. A steady hand. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. Therefore, in accordance with Article 17, Section B of the Corporate Bylaws, regarding incapacitation of the chairman, I propose myself as interim chairman, to guide Longting through these troubled waters. It was a coup, disguised as stewardship. Wei watched from her seat at the far end of the table, the seat reserved for the sidelined. The members nodded gravely. Director Huang, a portly man whose shipping subsidiary was notoriously inefficient and deeply loyal to Jianjun, was the first to speak. A wise proposal, Director Lin. The company needs your experience. Wei's mind raced. Article 17 was a blunt instrument, designed for this very purpose. A direct challenge was impossible, she had no votes, no allies. She needed something else. Not a sword, but a shield. Not a direct assault, but a procedural delay. Time was the only currency she could afford. She stood. All eyes turned to her. A moving sentiment, uncle, she said, her voice quiet but carrying in the tense silence. And of course. My father's health is the paramount concern for all of us. She looked at the assembled directors, her gaze sweeping over them, lingering for a fraction of a second on each. Which is why I must invoke Article 21. A murmur went through the room. Article 21 was an obscure, rarely used clause. Article 21, she continued, her voice gaining strength, states that in the event of a medical crisis affecting the chairman, no vote on succession can be held if the primary heir, myself, formally attests that the stress of such a vote could pose a direct threat to the chairman's recovery. It provides for a 30-day period of familial consideration before any leadership changes can be solidified. Jianjun's face, for the first time, lost its serene mask. A flicker of raw anger crossed his features before being suppressed. That clause is a relic, Wei. A formality. It is in the bylaws, uncle, Wei replied, her tone unyielding. And as you said, Longting was built on respect for our ways. All of them. She bowed her head slightly. I am formally attesting that this vote, at this time, would cause my father undue distress. I will not have his legacy decided while he lies helpless. We will wait 30 days. It was a flimsy pretext. A shield made of paper. But it was a shield that was written into the company's sacred texts. To deny it would be to show his hand too early, to appear as a usurper, not a steward. The men around the table looked at each other, uncomfortable. They were men of tradition. A daughter appealing to her father's well-being, using the company's own rules, was a move they could not easily counter without looking like monsters. Jianjun stared at her. A long, cold stare that promised retribution. Finally, he smiled, the warmth returning to his face like a veil being lowered. Of course, he said smoothly. The chairman's health comes first. We will honor his daughter's wishes. The vote is postponed. Wei took her seat, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had won nothing but a stay of execution. 30 days. 3 decades of her uncle's entrenched power against 30 days of her own frantic maneuvering. She looked across the table at the man who would tear his own family apart for a crown, and she knew this was not a battle for a company. It was a battle for survival, and the only rule was that she could not afford to lose. The Longting Spire was a glass and steel dragon coiling into the Shanghai sky, a monument to Lin Jisheng's ambition. For the next 30 days, it became Lin Wei's fortress, her prison. And her chessboard. Sleep became a luxury, measured in 20-minute increments on the gray minimalist sofa in her office. Her world shrank to the cool glow of encrypted screens, the hushed voice of Secretary May, and the bitter taste of stale coffee. While Jianjun worked the phones, calling in decades-old favors over dinners at exclusive clubs, Wei waged her war in the silent, digital ether. He is consolidating the domestic shareholders, May reported on day 3, placing a tablet on Wei's desk. Her face, usually a study in serene competence, was etched with worry. The old families. They see him as the continuation of your father. They see you as an experiment. An experiment can be successful, Wei murmured, not looking up from a complex network graph she was analyzing. It showed the flow of capital and influence within Longteng, a web of dependencies and obligations. He's using tradition as his weapon. We will use transparency as ours. May, I need everything on Director Huang's shipping subsidiary. Every contract, every invoice, every fuel purchase order for the last 5 years. Wei Xiaojie, that is a mountain of data. Then we must become mountaineers, Wei said simply. I suspect the peak is hiding something. For a week, they worked. May, with her encyclopedic knowledge of the company's labyrinthine bureaucracy, pulled the data. Wei, with her MIT-honed mind, built the algorithms to sift it. She found the pattern on day 9. It was elegant in its corruption. Director Huang's subsidiary was systematically overpaying for fuel from a single, obscure supplier. A shell corporation. Following the money trail led her to a network of offshore accounts, and the final account was registered to Huang's son. It wasn't just embezzlement. It was a dynasty of theft, passed from father to son. She did not leak it. A public scandal would hurt Longteng, and she needed Huang's vote, not his head on a platter. This was not about justice, it was about leverage. She summoned him to her office on the 52nd floor, a neutral territory far from the executive suites. Director Huang arrived, sweating slightly, his bulk seeming too large for the delicate rosewood chairs. He was expecting a plea, a negotiation from a position of weakness. Wei didn't speak. She simply turned her monitor toward him. On the screen, a single, devastating flowchart showed the flow of money from Longteng's accounts to his sons. She let him absorb it in silence. The color drained from his face. Your son has expensive tastes, Wei said, her voice neutral. That university in Switzerland is not cheap. Huang swallowed hard. His eyes darting from the screen to her face, searching for an angle. This is a misunderstanding. Is it? Wei asked. The data is quite clear. This isn't about the past, Director Huang. It's about the future. My uncle offers you the continuation of the old ways. A comfortable, predictable decline. I am offering you survival. What do you want? He rasped. Your subsidiary is dying, Wei stated. Not unkindly. My Datong system can save it. It will mean restructuring. It will mean some of your, less efficient managers will have to be retired. But the company will survive. Your legacy will survive. All I ask for in return is your vote. And your loyalty. She leaned forward slightly. This information remains on a secure, encrypted server. Only I have the key. Whether it stays there is entirely up to you. She was offering him a deal. Not a threat. A chance to align with the future instead of being consumed by the past. It was Wu Zetian offering a rival warlord a governorship instead of an execution. Huang was silent for a full minute, his heavy breathing the only sound in the room. He was a man of the old world, a world of handshakes and unspoken agreements. She had just shown him the new world, a world of cold, irrefutable data. You are your father's daughter, he finally said. A note of grudging awe in his voice. But you have your mother's precision. He stood, a slow, heavy movement. You will have my vote, Chairwoman Lin. He used the title before she had earned it. It was a capitulation. The shift was immediate. With Huang's allegiance, a key pillar of Jianjun's support crumbled. Other, more timid directors who were loyal to Huang began to waver. Wei had cracked the monolith. Jianjun, sensing the change in the current, retaliated with brutal speed. He couldn't fight her on data, so he fought her on character. He called a trusted contact at a popular, state-friendly media outlet. The article appeared 2 days later. It was a masterpiece of character assassination. Titled "The Western Wind in the House of Lin," it featured grainy photos from her university days in America, a party. A glass of wine in her hand, a male friend's arm draped casually over her shoulder. The text was filled with insinuation, painting her as a decadent, foreign-influenced libertine, Xiangjiaoren, a banana, yellow on the outside but white on the inside. It questioned her respect for family values, her filial piety, her very fitness to lead a great Chinese enterprise. The attack was personal, and it was effective. The old guard was scandalized. The company's internal forums lit up with gossip. The stock dipped 2 points on the news. Jianjun had changed the battlefield from the boardroom to the court of public opinion, a place where facts were irrelevant and perception was everything. Wei sat in her office, the article glowing on her screen. Mei stood beside her, her lips a thin, tight line. "This is beneath him," Mei said. Her voice vibrating with contempt. "No," Wei said, her eyes cold and focused. "This is exactly his level. He's trying to make me angry. He wants me to issue a denial, to get into a public war of words. He wants to drag me into the mud." She turned away from the screen, looking out at the city below. The lights of Shanghai glittered like a fallen galaxy. "He has reminded me of a valuable lesson my father taught me playing Go," she said softly. "Sometimes, to save the larger group, you must sacrifice a stone." Mei looked at her, confused. "He has attacked my honor," Wei clarified, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "So I must attack his foundation. The very thing that gives him the standing to judge me." She had known about the slush fund for years. It was an open secret in the family, a dark pool of money skimmed from state-partnered infrastructure projects. Used to grease palms, fund political campaigns, and cement Jianjun's power within the party. It was the source of his strength. To expose it would not just destroy him, it would send shockwaves through the company and its political allies. It would be an act of corporate treason. An act of familial annihilation. It was a line from which there was no return. She thought of her father, lying silent in his hospital bed. He had built this empire, this dynasty. And she, to save it, would have to burn part of it to the ground. She looked at a framed photo on her desk, a rare picture of herself as a teenager with her older brother, taken months before his fatal, climbing accident. Her brother, the true heir, the one Jianjun had always resented. In his memory, and in her father's, she would not fail. "Mei," she said, her voice devoid of all emotion. "Contact the reporter, Chen Li, at Caixin Weekly. The one who specializes in financial investigations. Tell her I have a story for her. An anonymous tip. Give her everything." Secretary Mei hesitated for only a second. She saw the look in Wei's eyes, the look of a general committing her entire army to a single, decisive battle. It was the look of a queen ordering an execution. "Yes, Wei Xiaojie," Mei said. And she left to light the fuse. The Caixin Weekly expose, titled "The Dragon's Shadow Coffers," landed like a precision-guided missile. It was a dense, meticulously researched piece, filled with leaked documents, offshore account numbers, and a clear, damning trail leading directly to Lin Jianjun and his network of political allies. The article didn't just allege corruption, it proved it with cold, hard facts. The fallout was instantaneous and catastrophic. Longting stock plummeted 12% in a single day of trading. Government regulators announced an immediate, high-profile investigation. Jianjun's political patrons, their names hinted at in the article, scrambled to distance themselves from him. The man who had postured as the guardian of tradition was exposed as a common thief on a grand scale. In the spire, a funereal silence descended. Jianjun was radioactive. The directors who had flocked to him now avoided his calls. His power, built on a foundation of perceived integrity and backroom influence, had been vaporized overnight. Wei felt no triumph. She felt only the vast, cold emptiness of a necessary act. She had sacrificed the stone, the company's short-term stability and reputation, to remove her uncle from the board. She had saved the kingdom by poisoning the well. The 30-day ceasefire was over. The shareholder meeting was scheduled for the following Friday. The battlefield was set. The grand ballroom of the Fairmont Peace Hotel, a historic landmark on the Bund, was chosen for the meeting. It was a deliberate choice by Wei, a neutral ground that evoked Shanghai's grand, international past, not Longting's insular, dynastic present. The air was thick with tension. Hundreds of shareholders, from powerful institutional investors and government fund managers to small, private stockholders, filled the room. The media was gathered outside, a frenzied pack held back by security. Jianjun arrived, looking haggard but defiant. He had been stripped of his directorships pending the investigation, but he still held significant personal shares and represented a bloc of conservative family stakeholders. He was wounded, but not yet dead. Wei entered last, flanked by Secretary Mei. She wore a simple, high-collared white dress, the color of mourning and purity. Her face was calm, her movements serene. She looked less like a corporate warrior and more like a priestess preparing for a solemn ritual. The meeting began with formalities. Then came the speeches. Jianjun took the stage first. He did not address the scandal directly. Instead, he delivered a powerful, emotional appeal to legacy. He spoke of his brother, Lin Jisheng, and the dream they had built together. He spoke of loyalty, of tradition, of the dangers of radical change guided by a foreign-trained mind that did not understand the soul of China. Longting is more than a company, he thundered, his voice cracking with emotion. It is a family. It is a legacy. And now it is under attack. From without and from within. He looked towards Wei, his eyes burning with a righteous fury. Do you entrust its future to stability, to experience, to one who has served it his entire life? Or do you hand it to ambition that knows no loyalty, no filial piety, an ambition that would burn down its own house to rule over the ashes? He had skillfully reframed his corruption as a consequence of her ambition. He was the victim. She, the aggressor. The domestic shareholders murmured their approval. He was speaking their language. Then, it was Wei's turn. She walked to the podium not with notes, but with a small remote. The massive screen behind her lit up. She did not speak of family or legacy. She spoke of numbers. Good morning, she began, her voice crisp and clear. For the last 30 years, Longting's growth has been stagnant. We call ourselves a technology and infrastructure giant, but we are a dinosaur. Our logistics are a decade out of date. Our management structure is bloated and inefficient. Our future, on its current path, is not growth. It is a slow, dignified death. Behind her, charts and graphs appeared, illustrating her points with brutal clarity. She showed their declining market share, their bloated operational costs. The side-by-side comparison with their global competitors. My uncle speaks of tradition, she said, her voice hardening. I see a tradition of complacency. He speaks of loyalty. I see a loyalty to the past that is strangling our future. He asks you to trust his experience. The data shows that his experience has led us to the brink of irrelevance. She clicked the remote. The screen changed to a detailed projection of her Detong system. This is not an academic exercise, she said, her eyes sweeping the room. This is a lifeline. This is a plan for a leaner, faster, more profitable Longting. A Longting that can compete not just in China, but on the world stage. She paused, letting the silence stretch. There is no honor in presiding over a magnificent decline. The greatest act of filial piety is not to preserve our father's company as a museum. It is to ensure it thrives for generations to come. It was a brilliant performance, a masterclass in appealing to the head, not the heart. But the room was still divided. The government funds were nervous. The old families were still with Jianjun. The vote would be razor-thin. And one final matter, Wei said, her voice dropping slightly, commanding the attention of everyone in the room. This was it. Her trump card. To fund the initial phase of Detong and to stabilize the company after the recent turmoil. I have spent the last month in negotiations. The screen changed again, showing the logos of two of the world's largest and most respected sovereign wealth funds, one from Singapore, one from Abu Dhabi. I am pleased to announce that I have secured a preliminary agreement for a strategic partnership. A $2 billion injection of capital into Longting Group, contingent on a leadership change and the immediate implementation of the Detong initiative. A gasp went through the ballroom. It was a move of breathtaking audacity. She hadn't just been fighting a defensive war, she had been mounting a global offensive. She had gone outside the family, outside China itself, and brought in foreign titans as her allies. She was not asking for the throne, she was arriving with her own army to claim it. Jianjun stared at the screen, his face ashen. He had been playing checkers. She had been playing three-dimensional chess. He was finished. The vote was a formality. Lin Wei won by a decisive margin. The sound of the final tally being announced echoed in the grand hall. It was the sound of a dynasty ending, and a new one beginning. As the room erupted into a chaos of reporters and frantic phone calls, Wei stood alone at the podium, perfectly still. She had won. She was Chairwoman Lin. She felt nothing. 6 months later, the chairman's office on the 88th floor was unrecognizable. The heavy, dark wood furniture and traditional calligraphy scrolls were gone. In their place were clean lines, white marble, and glass. A single, gnarled bonsai tree sat on a low table, the only concession to the past. Lin Wei ruled from behind a vast, empty desk, her only companions the silent, glowing screens that fed her a constant stream of global data. The Longting Group, under her leadership, was undergoing a brutal and brilliant transformation. She had shuttered inefficient subsidiaries, fired thousands of redundant managers, and poured capital into R&D and her Detong system. The stock, after its initial crash, had rebounded to an all-time high. The business world watched her with a mixture of terror and admiration. They called her the Iron Queen. She was on a video call with the European acquisitions team, her voice sharp and precise as she dissected a valuation report. Your margin for error is 0, she was saying. Recalculate the debt load. I want the real numbers, not the optimistic ones. Secretary May entered the room, her footsteps silent on the polished floor. She stood waiting, her face impassive. Wei finished her point, muted the call, and looked at her. It's your father, May said softly. He passed away an hour ago. Peacefully. Wei looked at May. Her own face was a perfect, placid mask. For a full 5 seconds, she said nothing. The only movement was her thumb, pressing a deep, white crescent into the back of her other hand. Thank you, May, she said. Her voice perfectly even. Clear my schedule for the rest of the day. Handle the arrangements. Private ceremony. Family only. She unmuted the call. Apologies, she said to the faces on the screen. As I was saying, the debt load is unacceptable. Let's move to page 4. She finished the meeting. When the final screen went dark, she was alone. The silence of the office was absolute. She rose from her desk and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window. The Shanghai skyline spread before her, a breathtaking tapestry of human ambition. Her empire. She had won. She had saved it. She had surpassed her father, she had avenged her brother, she had vanquished her enemies. She had everything she had ever wanted. She looked at her reflection in the glass, a solitary figure against the backdrop of a million glittering lights. And for the first time in a very Very long time, she could not calculate the cost. Years later, a young journalist writing a feature for a global business magazine would try to summarize her legacy. The article's headline would flash across screens from New York to London to Tokyo, "The Phoenix of Longtan, Visionary or Destroyer?" The piece would detail her stunning successes and her ruthless methods. It would quote disgraced rivals who called her a tyrant, and young, brilliant engineers who called her a savior. It would talk of the family she broke and the global powerhouse she built. It concluded that history's verdict was still out. But Lin Wei did not read the articles. She did not care for verdicts. She sat in her silent office, high above the world, watching the data streams, forever calculating, forever alone on her throne of glass and steel. Story 3. In the silent, air-conditioned chill of the Longtan Group's 88th floor boardroom, power had a distinct sound, the subtle, frictionless slide of a Mont-Blanc pen across a single sheet of paper. It was the only sound Lin Jianjun allowed as he made a single, dismissive note, his face a mask of avuncular disappointment. The presentation, Lin Wei's presentation, was over. "Brilliant, Wei," Jianjun said, the word "brilliant" curdling into an insult. He beamed at the board members, a dozen silver-haired men arranged around the vast obsidian table. A truly academic exercise. Perhaps something for a university journal. Lin Wei stood before them, a slim, severe figure in a dark silk suit that seemed to absorb the light. She did not flinch. She had anticipated this. Her presentation, a revolutionary AI-driven logistics network named Detong, Great Harmony, was designed to save the sprawling conglomerate billions. It was also designed to render the crony-filled subsidiaries her uncle controlled obsolete. She knew which part he had focused on. "With respect, uncle," she began, her voice as cool and level as the glass table between them, "the projections are based on hard data, not academia. A 22% efficiency increase in the first 3 years. Projections," Jianjun chuckled, a sound like stones grinding together. "My dear niece, Longtan was not built on projections. It was built on stone and steel, on relationships and respect for our ways." He gestured around the room, at the faces of men who owed their fortunes to her father, and by extension, to him, the keeper of the old ways. "It is too risky. Too disruptive." The word hung in the air, disruptive. It was a condemnation. In the world of Longtan, a world built on the Confucian bedrock of order and hierarchy, disruption was a sin. The board members nodded in slow, practiced unison. The verdict was delivered without a vote. Wei inclined her head in a gesture of perfect, filial submission. "I understand, Director Lin." She gathered her tablet, her movements economical and precise. Inside her, a cold, clean fury was coiling, but her face was a placid lake. As she walked toward the door, she could feel their eyes on her back, the pity, the condescension. The girl who played with numbers. The daughter who would never be a son. That night, the call came. It was Secretary Mei, her father's longtime assistant, her voice stripped of its usual unflappable calm. "Wei Xiaojie," she said, using the formal honorific for "young miss," "it's the chairman. A stroke. He's at the Shanghai Huashan Hospital." The world tilted on its axis. Wei drove through the neon-drenched canyons of Lujiazui, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. Her father, Lin Jisheng, was more than her father, he was the sun around which the entire Longtan system orbited. A force of nature, a titan of Chinese industry. To see him lying in a sterile white bed, a constellation of tubes and wires tethering him to the living world, was to see a monument fall. He was alive, the doctors said, but the stroke had been massive. He was non-communicative. A living ghost. As she stood by his bedside, tracing the lines on the back of her hand with her thumbnail, she wasn't just grieving for her father. She was calculating. A power vacuum is not an empty space. It is a vortex. And she knew, with absolute certainty, that her uncle was already moving to fill it. The dynasty was shattered. The war had begun. The emergency board meeting was called less than 48 hours later. Jianjun, dressed in somber gray, played the part of the grieving, responsible brother perfectly. "Our family, our company, faces its greatest crisis," he announced, his voice resonating with false gravity. "The chairman, my beloved brother, needs time to heal. In his absence, we need stability. A steady hand." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "Therefore, in accordance with Article 17, Section B of the corporate bylaws, regarding incapacitation of the chairman, I propose myself as interim chairman, to guide Longting through these troubled waters." It was a coup, disguised as stewardship. Wei watched from her seat at the far end of the table, the seat reserved for the sidelined. The members nodded gravely. Director Huang, a portly man whose shipping subsidiary was notoriously inefficient and deeply loyal to Jianjun, was the first to speak. "A wise proposal, Director Lin. The company needs your experience." Wei's mind raced. Article 17 was a blunt instrument, designed for this very purpose. A direct challenge was impossible, she had no votes, no allies. She needed something else. Not a sword, but a shield. Not a direct assault, but a procedural delay. Time was the only currency she could afford. She stood. All eyes turned to her. "A moving sentiment, uncle," she said, her voice quiet but carrying in the tense silence. "And of course, my father's health is the paramount concern for all of us." She looked at the assembled directors, her gaze sweeping over them, lingering for a fraction of a second on each. "Which is why I must invoke Article 21. A murmur went through the room. Article 21 was an obscure, rarely used clause. Article 21, she continued, her voice gaining strength, states that in the event of a medical crisis affecting the chairman, no vote on succession can be held if the primary heir, myself, formally attests that the stress of such a vote could pose a direct threat to the chairman's recovery. It provides for a 30-day period of familial consideration before any leadership changes can be solidified." Jianjun's face, for the first time, lost its serene mask. A flicker of raw anger crossed his features before being suppressed. "That clause is a relic, Wei. A formality." "It is in the bylaws, uncle," Wei replied, her tone unyielding. "And as you said, Longton was built on respect for our ways. All of them." She bowed her head slightly. "I am formally attesting that this vote, at this time, would cause my father undue distress. I will not have his legacy decided while he lies helpless. We will wait 30 days. It was a flimsy pretext, a shield made of paper. But it was a shield that was written into the company's sacred texts. To deny it would be to show his hand too early, to appear as a usurper, not a steward. The men around the table looked at each other, uncomfortable. They were men of tradition. A daughter appealing to her father's well-being, using the company's own rules, was a move they could not easily counter without looking like monsters. Jianjun stared at her, a long, cold stare that promised retribution. Finally, he smiled, the warmth returning to his face like a veil being lowered. "Of course," he said smoothly. "The chairman's health comes first. We will honor his daughter's wishes. The vote is postponed." Wei took her seat, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had won nothing but a stay of execution. 30 days. 3 decades of her uncle's entrenched power against 30 days of her own frantic maneuvering. She looked across the table at the man who would tear his own family apart for a crown, and she knew this was not a battle for a company. It was a battle for survival, and the only rule was that she could not afford to lose. The Longting Spire was a glass and steel dragon coiling into the Shanghai sky. A monument to Lin Jisheng's ambition. For the next 30 days, it became Lin Wei's fortress, her prison, and her chessboard. Sleep became a luxury, measured in 20-minute increments on the gray minimalist sofa in her office. Her world shrank to the cool glow of encrypted screens, the hushed voice of Secretary Mei, and the bitter taste of stale coffee. While Jianjun worked the phones, calling in decades-old favors over dinners at exclusive clubs. Wei waged her war in the silent, digital ether. He is consolidating the domestic shareholders, May reported on day 3, placing a tablet on Wei's desk. Her face, usually a study in serene competence, was etched with worry. The old families. They see him as the continuation of your father. They see you as an experiment. An experiment can be successful, Wei murmured, not looking up from a complex network graph she was analyzing. It showed the flow of capital and influence within Longtan, a web of dependencies and obligations. He's using tradition as his weapon. We will use transparency as ours. May, I need everything on Director Huang's shipping subsidiary. Every contract, every invoice, every fuel purchase order for the last 5 years. Wei Xiaojie, that is a mountain of data. Then we must become mountaineers, Wei said simply. I suspect the peak is hiding something. For a week, they worked. May, with her encyclopedic knowledge of the company's labyrinth and bureaucracy, pulled the data. Wei, with her MIT-honed mind, built the algorithms to sift it. She found the pattern on day 9. It was elegant in its corruption. Director Huang's subsidiary was systematically overpaying for fuel from a single, obscure supplier. A shell corporation. Following the money trail led her to a network of offshore accounts, and the final account was registered to Huang's son. It wasn't just embezzlement, it was a dynasty of theft, passed from father to son. She did not leak it. A public scandal would hurt Longtan, and she needed Huang's vote, not his head on a platter. This was not about justice, it was about leverage. She summoned him to her office on the 52nd floor. A neutral territory far from the executive suites. Director Huang arrived, sweating slightly, his bulk seeming too large for the delicate rosewood chairs. He was expecting a plea, a negotiation from a position of weakness. Wei didn't speak. She simply turned her monitor toward him. On the screen, a single, devastating flowchart showed the flow of money from Longtan's accounts to his sons. She let him absorb it in silence. The color drained from his face. Your son has expensive tastes, Wei said, her voice neutral. That university in Switzerland is not cheap. Huang swallowed hard, his eyes darting from the screen to her face, searching for an angle. This is a misunderstanding. Is it? Wei asked. The data is quite clear. This isn't about the past, Director Huang. It's about the future. My uncle offers you the continuation of the old ways. A comfortable, predictable decline. I am offering you survival. What do you want? He rasped. Your subsidiary is dying, Wei stated, not unkindly. My Datong system can save it. It will mean restructuring. It will mean some of your, less efficient managers will have to be retired. But the company will survive. Your legacy will survive. All I ask for in return is your vote. And your loyalty. She leaned forward slightly. This information remains on a secure, encrypted server. Only I have the key. Whether it stays there is entirely up to you. She was offering him a deal, not a threat. A chance to align with the future instead of being consumed by the past. It was Wu Zetian offering a rival warlord a governorship instead of an execution. Huang was silent for a full minute, his heavy breathing the only sound in the room. He was a man of the old world, a world of handshakes and unspoken agreements. She had just shown him the new world, a world of cold, irrefutable data. You are your father's daughter, he finally said, a note of grudging awe in his voice. But you have your mother's, precision. He stood, a slow, heavy movement. You will have my vote, Chairwoman Lin. He used the title before she had earned it. It was a capitulation. The shift was immediate. With Huang's allegiance, a key pillar of Jianjun's support crumbled. Other, more timid directors who were loyal to Huang began to waver. Wei had cracked the monolith. Jianjun, sensing the change in the current, retaliated with brutal speed. He couldn't fight her on data, so he fought her on character. He called a trusted contact at a popular, state-friendly media outlet. The article appeared 2 days later. It was a masterpiece of character assassination. Titled "The Western Wind in the House of Lin," it featured grainy photos from her university days in America, a party, a glass of wine in her hand, a male friend's arm draped casually over her shoulder. The text was filled with insinuation, painting her as a decadent, foreign-influenced libertine, Xiangjiao Ren, a banana, yellow on the outside but white on the inside. It questioned her respect for family values, her filial piety, her very fitness to lead a great Chinese enterprise. The attack was personal, and it was effective. The old guard was scandalized. The company's internal forums lit up with gossip. The stock dipped 2 points on the news. Jianjun had changed the battlefield from the boardroom to the court of public opinion, a place where facts were irrelevant and perception was everything. Wei sat in her office. The article glowing on her screen. Mei stood beside her, her lips a thin, tight line. "This is beneath him," Mei said, her voice vibrating with contempt. "No," Wei said, her eyes cold and focused. "This is exactly his level. He's trying to make me angry. He wants me to issue a denial, to get into a public war of words. He wants to drag me into the mud." She turned away from the screen, looking out at the city below. The lights of Shanghai glittered like a fallen galaxy. "He has reminded me of a valuable lesson my father taught me playing Go," she said softly. "Sometimes, to save the larger group, you must sacrifice a stone." Mei looked at her, confused. "He has attacked my honor," Wei clarified, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "So I must attack his foundation. The very thing that gives him the standing to judge me." She had known about the slush fund for years. It was an open secret in the family, a dark pool of money skimmed from state-partnered infrastructure projects, used to grease palms, fund political campaigns, and cement Jianjun's power within the party. It was the source of his strength. To expose it would not just destroy him, it would send shockwaves through the company and its political allies. It would be an act of corporate treason. An act of familial annihilation. It was a line from which there was no return. She thought of her father, lying silent in his hospital bed. He had built this empire, this dynasty. And she, to save it, would have to burn part of it to the ground. She looked at a framed photo on her desk, a rare picture of herself as a teenager with her older brother, taken months before his fatal, climbing accident. Her brother, the true heir, the one Jianjun had always resented. In his memory, and in her father's, she would not fail. "Mei," she said, her voice devoid of all emotion. "Contact the reporter, Chen Li, at Caixin Weekly. The one who specializes in financial investigations. Tell her I have a story for her. An anonymous tip. Give her everything." Secretary Mei hesitated for only a second. She saw the look in Wei's eyes, the look of a general committing her entire army to a single, decisive battle. It was the look of a queen ordering an execution. "Yes, Wei Xiaojie," Mei said. And she left to light the fuse. The Caixin Weekly exposé, titled "The Dragon's Shadow Coffers," landed like a precision-guided missile. It was a dense, meticulously researched piece, filled with leaked documents, offshore account numbers, and a clear, damning trail leading directly to Lin Jianjun and his network of political allies. The article didn't just allege corruption, it proved it with cold, hard facts. The fallout was instantaneous and catastrophic. Longting stock plummeted 12% in a single day of trading. Government regulators announced an immediate, high-profile investigation. Jianjun's political patrons, their names hinted at in the article, scrambled to distance themselves from him. The man who had postured as the guardian of tradition was exposed as a common thief on a grand scale. In the spire, a funereal silence descended. Jianjun was radioactive. The directors who had flocked to him now avoided his calls. His power, built on a foundation of perceived integrity and backroom influence, had been vaporized overnight. Wei felt no triumph. She felt only the vast, cold emptiness of a necessary act. She had sacrificed the stone, the company's short-term stability and reputation, to remove her uncle from the board. She had saved the kingdom by poisoning the well. The 30-day ceasefire was over. The shareholder meeting was scheduled for the following Friday. The battlefield was set. The grand ballroom of the Fairmont Peace Hotel, a historic landmark on the Bund, was chosen for the meeting. It was a deliberate choice by Wei, a neutral ground that evoked Shanghai's grand, international past, not Longting's insular, dynastic present. The air was thick with tension. Hundreds of shareholders, from powerful institutional investors and government fund managers to small, private stockholders, filled the room. The media was gathered outside, a frenzied pack held back by security. Jianjun arrived, looking haggard but defiant. He had been stripped of his directorships pending the investigation, but he still held significant personal shares and represented a bloc of conservative family stakeholders. He was wounded, but not yet dead. Wei entered last, flanked by Secretary Mei. She wore a simple, high-collared white dress, the color of mourning and purity. Her face was calm, her movements serene. She looked less like a corporate warrior and more like a priestess preparing for a solemn ritual. The meeting began with formalities. Then came the speeches. Jianjun took the stage first. He did not address the scandal directly. Instead, he delivered a powerful, emotional appeal to legacy. He spoke of his brother, Lin Jisheng, and the dream they had built together. He spoke of loyalty, of tradition, of the dangers of radical change guided by a foreign-trained mind that did not understand the soul of China. Longting is more than a company, he thundered, his voice cracking with emotion. It is a family. It is a legacy. And now it is under attack. From without and from within. He looked towards Wei, his eyes burning with a righteous fury. Do you entrust its future to stability, to experience, to one who has served it his entire life? Or do you hand it to ambition that knows no loyalty, no filial piety, an ambition that would burn down its own house to rule over the ashes? He had skillfully reframed his corruption as a consequence of her ambition. He was the victim. She, the aggressor. The domestic shareholders murmured their approval. He was speaking their language. Then, it was Wei's turn. She walked to the podium not with notes, but with a small remote. The massive screen behind her lit up. She did not speak of family or legacy. She spoke of numbers. Good morning, she began, her voice crisp and clear. For the last 30 years, Longting's growth has been stagnant. We call ourselves a technology and infrastructure giant, but we are a dinosaur. Our logistics are a decade out of date. Our management structure is bloated and inefficient. Our future, on its current path, is not growth. It is a slow, dignified death. Behind her, charts and graphs appeared, illustrating her points with brutal clarity. She showed their declining market share, their bloated operational costs. The side-by-side comparison with their global competitors. My uncle speaks of tradition, she said, her voice hardening. I see a tradition of complacency. He speaks of loyalty. I see a loyalty to the past that is strangling our future. He asks you to trust his experience. The data shows that his experience has led us to the brink of irrelevance. She clicked the remote. The screen changed to a detailed projection of her Detong system. This is not an academic exercise, she said, her eyes sweeping the room. This is a lifeline. This is a plan for a leaner, faster, more profitable Longting. A Longting that can compete not just in China, but on the world stage. She paused, letting the silence stretch. There is no honor in presiding over a magnificent decline. The greatest act of filial piety is not to preserve our father's company as a museum. It is to ensure it thrives for generations to come. It was a brilliant performance, a masterclass in appealing to the head, not the heart. But the room was still divided. The government funds were nervous. The old families were still with Jianjun. The vote would be razor-thin. And one final matter, Wei said, her voice dropping slightly, commanding the attention of everyone in the room. This was it. Her trump card. To fund the initial phase of Detong and to stabilize the company after the recent turmoil. I have spent the last month in negotiations. The screen changed again, showing the logos of two of the world's largest and most respected sovereign wealth funds, one from Singapore, one from Abu Dhabi. I am pleased to announce that I have secured a preliminary agreement for a strategic partnership. A $2 billion injection of capital into Longting Group, contingent on a leadership change and the immediate implementation of the Detong initiative. A gasp went through the ballroom. It was a move of breathtaking audacity. She hadn't just been fighting a defensive war, she had been mounting a global offensive. She had gone outside the family, outside China itself, and brought in foreign titans as her allies. She was not asking for the throne, she was arriving with her own army to claim it. Jianjun stared at the screen, his face ashen. He had been playing checkers. She had been playing three-dimensional chess. He was finished. The vote was a formality. Lin Wei won by a decisive margin. The sound of the final tally being announced echoed in the grand hall. It was the sound of a dynasty ending, and a new one beginning. As the room erupted into a chaos of reporters and frantic phone calls, Wei stood alone at the podium, perfectly still. She had won. She was Chairwoman Lin. She felt nothing. 6 months later, the chairman's office on the 88th floor was unrecognizable. The heavy, dark wood furniture and traditional calligraphy scrolls were gone. In their place were clean lines, white marble, and glass. A single, gnarled bonsai tree sat on a low table, the only concession to the past. Lin Wei ruled from behind a vast, empty desk, her only companions the silent, glowing screens that fed her a constant stream of global data. The Longting Group, under her leadership, was undergoing a brutal and brilliant transformation. She had shuttered inefficient subsidiaries, fired thousands of redundant managers, and poured capital into R&D and her Detong system. The stock, after its initial crash, had rebounded to an all-time high. The business world watched her with a mixture of terror and admiration. They called her the Iron Queen. She was on a video call with the European acquisitions team, her voice sharp and precise as she dissected a valuation report. Your margin for error is 0, she was saying. Recalculate the debt load. I want the real numbers, not the optimistic ones. Secretary May entered the room, her footsteps silent on the polished floor. She stood waiting, her face impassive. Wei finished her point, muted the call, and looked at her. It's your father, May said softly. He passed away an hour ago. Peacefully. Wei looked at May. Her own face was a perfect, placid mask. For a full 5 seconds, she said nothing. The only movement was her thumb, pressing a deep, white crescent into the back of her other hand. Thank you, May, she said. Her voice perfectly even. Clear my schedule for the rest of the day. Handle the arrangements. Private ceremony. Family only. She unmuted the call. Apologies, she said to the faces on the screen. As I was saying, the debt load is unacceptable. Let's move to page 4. She finished the meeting. When the final screen went dark, she was alone. The silence of the office was absolute. She rose from her desk and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window. The Shanghai skyline spread before her, a breathtaking tapestry of human ambition. Her empire. She had won. She had saved it. She had surpassed her father, she had avenged her brother, she had vanquished her enemies. She had everything she had ever wanted. She looked at her reflection in the glass, a solitary figure against the backdrop of a million glittering lights. And for the first time in a very, very long time, she could not calculate the cost. Years later, a young journalist writing a feature for a global business magazine would try to summarize her legacy. The article's headline would flash across screens from New York to London to Tokyo, the Phoenix of Longting, visionary or destroyer. The piece would detail her stunning successes and her ruthless methods. It would quote disgraced rivals who called her a tyrant, and young, brilliant engineers who called her a savior. It would talk of the family she broke and the global powerhouse she built. It concluded that history's verdict was still out. But Lin Wei did not read the articles. She did not care for verdicts. She sat in her silent office, high above the world, watching the data streams, forever calculating, forever alone on her throne of glass and steel. Story 4. How can a line contain the truth? A line of ink on papyrus, drawn by a hand that trembles not from fear, but from devotion. A line can bind, it can separate, it can define the edge of the world or the shape of a god. But can it tell the truth? In Rome, truth was a currency minted by the powerful. It was the shining marble of the Forum, not the cracked plaster of the Subura. It was the triumphant face of the emperor on a golden aureus, not the hollow-eyed stare of a beggar in the rain-soaked alleys. Truth was a story told from the top down, a narrative polished until it gleamed with divine approval. Livia's truth was different. It lived in the grit under her fingernails, in the acrid smell of iron gall ink, and in the whisper-thin lines that bled from her stylus to form the city she knew, not the city she was told to see. Her workshop was a small, stuffy room on the fourth floor of a creaking insula, a world away from the gleaming temples of the Capitoline Hill. Here, the air was thick not with the scent of sacred incense, but with the dust of ground pigments, the deep, earthy red of hematite, the brilliant yellow of orpiment, the precious, vibrant blue of lapis lazuli imported from the distant east. This room was her sanctuary and her prison. Light struggled through a single, grimy window that overlooked a courtyard echoing with the constant noise of the city, the shouting of vendors, the crying of a neighbor's child, the distant, rhythmic clang of a blacksmith's hammer. Livia sat hunched over a large sheet of vellum, her body a curve of concentration. She was in her early 20s, slender from meager meals, with dark, intense eyes that missed nothing. But her identity was not in her face, it was in her hands. The fingers of her right hand were a permanent testament to her craft, the skin stained a mottled mosaic of black and sepia, the knuckles calloused from a lifetime of gripping a brush. They were the hands of a pictor, a painter, a mapmaker, heir to a craft that was both sacred art and dangerous science. Today, they were still. She stared at the vellum. At the half-formed outline of the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus, its lines perfect, its proportions divine. It was a lie. A beautiful, expertly rendered lie. A memory, sharp and unwelcome as a shard of glass, pierced the quiet focus of her work. Her father's hands. Not stained with ink, but swollen and purple, the bones unnaturally angled. She remembered the day the legionary magistrate had visited their far more spacious, respectable workshop near the Forum. Her father, celebrated for his military maps, had been commissioned to create a depiction of the recent campaign in Dacia. He had drawn it with his usual, unforgiving accuracy, the swampy terrain that had bogged down the legions, the exact placement of the ambush that had cost them the eagle of the 5th, the faces of the captured soldiers, etched with exhaustion and defeat. The magistrate had unrolled the papyrus, his face tightening with every detail. "This is not a tribute to Roman victory," he had hissed, his voice low and dangerous. "This is a catalogue of our failures. It is, truth. And truth, pictor, is a luxury the state cannot afford." The charge was impiety, of disrespecting the divine fortune of Rome. The punishment was not death. It was worse. It was a message. They broke his hands, the tools of his trade, ensuring he would never draw another line again. The knock on her door was sharp, imperious. It was not the shuffling footstep of a client or the heavy tread of her landlord. It was a sound that belonged to the marble halls of power, jarringly out of place in this world of crumbling plaster and shared latrines. She took a breath, smoothed down her simple linen stola, and opened the door. Two temple lictors, their faces impassive stone, stood in the narrow hallway, their fasces, bundles of rods signifying their authority, held stiffly. Between them stood a man whose presence seemed to suck the very air from the corridor. He was in his 50s, his face a mask of severe, intelligent lines, his body wrapped in the pristine white toga of a senator, edged with the purple stripe of his rank. But it was the small, flamed cap, the apex, that identified him. This was Pontifex Valerius, a man whose voice could sway the Senate and whose pronouncements on religious law were said to echo the will of Jupiter himself. Livia, daughter of Marcus. His voice was calm, yet it carried the weight of absolute authority. She inclined her head, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. I am she, Pontifex. I have seen your work, he said. His eyes sweeping over her small workshop, dismissing the squalor as irrelevant. He saw the scrolls stacked neatly, the pigments arranged by hue, the clean lines of the practice sketches pinned to the wall. You have your father's gift for the line, but you have tempered it with a piety he lacked. Livia said nothing. Piety was what they called the sanitized, flattering work she produced to survive, portraits of wealthy merchants that softened their jowls, architectural drawings that erased the cracks in their villas. The emperor, in his divine wisdom, has decreed the construction of a new archive, a testament to the glory of our city, Valerius continued, his gaze finally settling on her. And I have been tasked with commissioning its centerpiece. A map. The definitive map of Rome. Not the fleeting city of wood and brick, but the eternal city of marble and myth. The Forma Urbis Romi Aeterna. It will be carved into the very walls of the archive, a guide for generations to come. And you, Livia, will be the one to draw it. It was the commission of a lifetime, an honor that would bring wealth, status, and security beyond her wildest dreams. It was what her father had always wanted for her. And it was a death sentence for her soul. I am honored, Pontifex, she managed. Her voice a stranger to her own ears. You will be given access to the official city records, the finest materials, and a generous stipend, Valerius said, a flicker of something like satisfaction in his eyes. I require your preliminary sketches for the Capitoline Hill within the month. I expect them to be worthy. Worthy of the gods, and of the emperor who serves them. He turned to leave, the lictors moving with him like shadows. Do not disappoint me, Livia. Your father's failing was to believe that truth was found in dirt and defeat. Remember that the only truth that matters is the one that proves we are eternal. The door closed, leaving Livia alone in the sudden silence. She walked back to her desk and looked at the perfect, dishonest lines of the temple she had been drawing. Valerius was wrong. Her father had not believed truth was found in dirt. He had believed that ignoring the dirt, pretending it did not exist, was the highest form of blasphemy. She picked up a stick of charcoal, her stained fingers closing around it. On a scrap piece of papyrus, she began to draw. Not the grand colonnade of the temple, but the tangled, filthy alley behind it, where a drain overflowed and a stray dog gnawed on a discarded bone. The lines were quick, angry, and honest. They were the beginning of her real map. The month that followed was a descent into a dual reality. By day, Livia was the honored artist of the Pontifex. She walked through the forum, not as a scurrying plebeian, but as a woman with a purpose, clutching a pass that granted her entry to the tabularium, the official records office of Rome. There, surrounded by the dry, rustling sound of ancient scrolls, she studied the city's official face. She unrolled cadastral surveys that detailed the landholdings of the patrician families, their vast estates drawn with clean, possessive lines. She examined architectural blueprints for the great temples and basilicas, rendered with mathematical perfection, showing no sign of the wear and tear of time, no hint of the crumbling mortar or the pigeon droppings that stained their marble eaves. This was Valerius's Rome. It was a city of flawless geometry, a city of power and proclamation. It existed on papyrus as a declaration of divine favor, a place without shadows. In the vast, silent halls of the tabularium, she would diligently copy these official lies, her hand steady, her expression demure. She created sketches of the Capitoline Hill that would have made the Pontifex weep with joy. She drew the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus as if it had been built that morning by the gods themselves. Its marble gleaming, its proportions soaring to a sky unmarred by the city's constant haze of smoke. She rendered the sacred geese in the precinct of Juno Moneta as noble guardians, not the fat, aggressive birds that hissed at anyone who came too close. This was her mask, her performance of piety. But by night, she lived in another Rome. After returning to her insula, she would bar the flimsy door, light a single, smoky oil lamp, and unroll a different kind of scroll. This was her own project, the one she now thought of as the veritas urbis, the truth of the city. On a huge, costly sheet of vellum she had purchased with the first part of Valerius's stipend, she began to plot her own map. Her work from the tabularium provided the skeleton, the accurate placement of the major monuments and streets. But it was her own explorations that gave it a soul. Her evenings were spent walking. She would trade her respectable stola for the drab, hooded cloak of a commoner and lose herself in the city's labyrinthine heart. She walked the Subura, the sprawling, chaotic district crammed with towering, dangerously unstable insulae. Here, the streets were narrow trenches of mud and refuse, and life spilled out from every doorway. She sketched the intricate web of ropes strung between buildings, heavy with drying laundry that dripped onto the heads of passers-by. She drew the faces of the people, the exhausted dockworker hauling a sack of grain from a Tiber barge, the sharp-eyed vendor selling roasted dormice on a stick, the gaunt woman begging with a listless child in her arms. These were the faces Valerius's Rome erased. Her father's warning was a constant echo in her mind. He had been punished for showing the weakness of the legions, a truth that undermined the myth of invincibility. She was documenting the weakness of the city itself, a truth that undermined the myth of eternity. The risk was immense. To be discovered would not just mean the loss of the commission, it would mean a charge of sacrilege, of maliciously defaming the divine city. The punishment would be swift and terrible. This fear led her to the Aventine Hill, to a dusty, cluttered apartment above a noisy tavern. It was the home of Cassius, a man who had once been her father's closest friend. A Greek philosopher of the Stoic school, Cassius had been a respected teacher until his lectures on the nature of universal truth and the moral obligations of the individual were deemed a corrupting influence on the youth of Rome. He had been formally censured by the Senate, stripped of his teaching position, and now lived in obscurity, surrounded by the only things he had left, his scrolls and his cynical wisdom. He was a stooped, thin man with a wispy gray beard and eyes that still held a spark of defiant intellect. His room smelled of old papyrus and cheap wine. "So, the wolf has invited the lamb to paint its portrait," Cassius rasped after Livia explained her commission. He poured them both a cup of watered-down wine. "And the lamb, being the daughter of a lion, has decided to paint the wolf's teeth as well as its noble brow." "I have to," Livia whispered, her hands clutching the cup. "When I draw their Rome, I feel him, my father, shaking his head. I feel like I am breaking his hands all over again." Cassius looked at her, his expression softening. "Your father's crime, Livia, was not in drawing the truth. It was in showing it to the liars. Truth is a weapon. You must be careful where you point it. What is it you need from this old ghost?" "Knowledge," she said. "The city's secrets. The places not on the official scrolls. The histories they have tried to bury." For the next few weeks, Cassius became her guide into the city's hidden memory. He owned forbidden books. Histories written by men who had fallen out of political favor, accounts of plagues that had been officially downplayed, lists of noble families who had been erased from the records after failed conspiracies. He told her of the cults that flourished in the city's shadows, the followers of Isis who met in hidden chambers, the devotees of Mithras who worshipped in subterranean temples. With his guidance, her true map grew in complexity and danger. She added the location of a forgotten mass grave from the last plague, now paved over for a new marketplace. She marked the secret Mithraeum beneath a bathhouse, its entrance concealed behind a loose wall. She drew the network of smugglers' tunnels near the Emporium, the city's main port on the Tiber. Her map was no longer just a depiction of a place, it was becoming a narrative of the city's soul. A testament to all that was hidden, ignored, and suppressed. One evening, as she sketched the graffiti on a wall near the Circus Maximus, a crude caricature of the emperor with the ears of a donkey, the heavy tread of the vigiles, the night watch, echoed down the alley. Her blood ran cold. She pressed herself into a darkened doorway, her heart pounding against her ribs. 2 guards swaggered past, their torches casting flickering, monstrous shadows. One of them stopped, holding his torch up to the wall. "Look at this filth," he grunted. "Insulting the divine Augustus. If I find the scum who drew this, I'll break his fingers myself." His partner laughed. "You'd have to break the fingers of half the city, Marcus. Come on, I'm thirsty." They moved on, their laughter fading into the night. Livia leaned against the cold stone, breathing heavily. It was a close call, a stark reminder of the razor's edge she walked. She looked down at her own ink-stained fingers, the tools of her own quiet rebellion. The guard's words were a chilling echo of her father's fate. She hurried back to her workshop, the fear a cold knot in her stomach. But as she lit her lamp and looked upon her growing, secret masterpiece, the fear was consumed by a familiar, burning resolve. This truth was worth the risk. It had to be. The day came to present her preliminary sketches to Valerius. She chose her most pious, most lifeless drawings of the Capitoline Hill. She met him in his opulent office on the Forum, a room filled with Greek statues and intricate mosaics. He unrolled the scrolls, his sharp eyes scanning the work. He nodded slowly, a thin, satisfied smile gracing his lips. "Excellent," he declared. "You have captured the majesty, the divine order. You have chosen the line of the poet, not the bookkeeper. This is a worthy beginning." He handed her a heavy purse of coins. "Continue your work. The emperor himself has expressed an interest in its progress." Livia felt a chill despite the warmth of the room. The emperor. The stakes had just been raised immeasurably. She walked away from the Forum, the purse heavy in her hand, feeling like a spy returning from a successful mission in enemy territory. The city felt different now. Every street corner, every crumbling wall, every face in the crowd was a detail waiting to be added to her secret testament, her act of defiance against the beautiful, terrible lie of eternal Rome. The work consumed her. Days bled into nights, and the line between Livia the pious artist and Livia the secret chronicler began to blur. The official map became a chore, a mechanical exercise in creating flawless, soulless beauty. Her true passion, her dangerous obsession, was the veritas urbis. Her vellum sheet was now a sprawling, intricate tapestry of Roman life, a world away from the sterile plans in the tabularium. She developed a system. Using different colored inks, she began to layer her map with information. Black ink for the physical structures, the buildings, the roads, the bridges. Sepia ink for the flow of people and commerce, the major trade routes through the city, the crowded markets, the paths of the funeral processions. And a closely guarded, expensive red ink, made from crushed cochineal insects, for the city's hidden lifeblood, the locations of illegal guilds, the secret meeting places of forbidden cults, the forgotten wells where the poor drew water, defying the state's taxed aqueducts. Her relationship with Cassius deepened. He was more than a source of information, he became her intellectual anchor. In his dusty room, over cups of cheap wine, they would have hushed, intense debates. "You mapped the city's body, Livia," he told her one evening, tracing a finger over a section she had just completed showing the labyrinthine alleyways of the Transtiberum district. "But a map is not the territory. You draw the sewer drains, but can you draw the despair of the people who live above them? You mark a secret shrine, but can you capture the hope of the woman who prays there?" "No," Livia admitted, her voice low. "A line can only show where, not why. But the where is a start. The official maps pretend this shrine doesn't even exist. They pretend the woman isn't there. My map says she is. It says, here, in this place, a life is being lived. Isn't that a truth worth recording?" "It is," Cassius conceded, his old eyes thoughtful. "But it is an incendiary truth. Valerius and his kind are not just hiding the cracks in the walls, child. They are hiding the cracks in the very idea of Rome. Their power rests on the belief that Rome is a perfect, divinely ordained entity. Your map suggests it is a messy, flawed, human creation. To them, that is not just heresy. It is treason. His words were a constant, sobering presence, but they did not deter her. Instead, they sharpened her focus. She realized she wasn't just mapping a city, she was mapping a conflict, the eternal struggle between the marble facade of imperial power and the chaotic, vibrant, suffering humanity that teemed in its shadows. Her work on the official map, paradoxically, improved. Her nightly excursions into the city's raw reality gave her a deeper understanding of its structure. Her sanitized drawings of the Palatine Hill mansions gained a subtle, convincing weight because she now knew precisely how the hill sloped down into the squalor of the valley below. Valerius was pleased. He saw her growing skill as a sign of her devotion to his project. He was too insulated by his own power to imagine that her inspiration came not from his marble ideals, but from the very dirt he sought to erase. The project became her entire world. The faces in the street were no longer a blur, they were potential stories. The crumbling brickwork of an aqueduct was not just decay, it was a testament to time and neglect, a detail to be recorded. She grew bolder, taking greater risks. She paid a sewer worker a few bronze coins to guide her through the dark, stinking tunnels of the Cloaca Maxima, sketching the vast, hidden underworld by lamplight. She disguised herself as a mourner to gain entry to a columbarium, a communal tomb, so she could map its intricate network of niches holding the ashes of countless, forgotten citizens. The tension of her dual life began to take its toll. She grew thinner, her eyes perpetually shadowed with fatigue. She would start at every sudden noise, her hand instinctively moving to cover the secret map, which she now kept rolled inside a false bottom of a large pigment chest. One afternoon, a new acolyte of Valerius, a young, ambitious priest with a sharp, inquisitive face, paid a surprise visit to her workshop. His official reason was to deliver a new supply of premium papyrus. But his eyes lingered, scanning every detail of her room. "The Pontifex is most impressed with your progress, Pictor," the acolyte said. His voice smooth as oil. "He speaks of your dedication. He says you spend all your waking hours devoted to the Forma Aeterna." "The city is a grand subject," Livia replied, her voice carefully neutral as she stood in front of the pigment chest. "It demands one's full attention to do it justice." "Indeed," the acolyte murmured, his gaze falling on a small sketch pinned to the wall, a practiced drawing of a complex street corner near the Viminal Hill. "Your detail is remarkable. One can almost smell the baker's oven from here. Tell me, how do you achieve such realism from the dry scrolls of the tabularium?" It was a test. A baited question. "I walked the city, of course," Livia said, forcing a light, artistic laugh. "An artist cannot draw the light on the forum without feeling the sun on her own face. The Pontifex himself encourages a pious study of the subject." The acolyte smiled. But the smile did not reach his eyes. "Of course. A pious study. Be well, Pictor. He left. The moment the door closed, Livia sank onto her stool, her body trembling. He knew. Or he suspected. The question was too pointed, his observation too keen. It was not a casual visit, it was reconnaissance. They were watching her. She hurried to Cassius's apartment that evening, her fear a palpable thing. "They know," she told him. Her voice ragged. "They are watching me. I have to stop." Cassius listened patiently, then took her hands in his own frail ones. "Livia. Did you truly believe you could wage a silent war against an empire and not be noticed? Fear is the price of defiance. You have two choices. You can burn your map, return to your life of pious lies, and live with the ghost of your father's approval forever out of reach. Or you can finish what you started. But they will kill me, Cassius." "They might," he said, his voice soft but firm. "Or they might simply break your hands. But let me ask you this. What life would you have after you burned that map? Every time you saw a grand procession, every time you heard a politician praise the eternal city, the lie would choke you. You would be a prisoner in a city of ghosts, your father's. And your own. The body may be safe, but the soul would be in chains. That is a fate worse than death. He gestured to his dusty scrolls. These are the words of men who were exiled, executed, forced to drink hemlock. But their words live on. Their truth survived. Your map, it is your truth. It deserves to survive. His words settled the storm inside her. The fear did not vanish, but it solidified into a hard, cold resolve. He was right. She had come too far to turn back. The thought of abandoning her map was more terrifying than the thought of Valerius's wrath. It was the only thing that was truly hers. She returned to her workshop with a renewed, almost feverish sense of purpose. The danger, now confirmed, added a new layer of intensity to her work. Every line she drew felt like a final act, a race against a closing fist. She began to work on the most dangerous sections of all, a detailed layout of the imperial palace on the Palatine Hill, based on whispered information from a disgruntled servant, and a precise marking of the barracks of the Praetorian Guard, the emperor's formidable and feared personal army. She was no longer just mapping the city's life, she was mapping the architecture of its power and its paranoia. Her movements became more furtive. Her senses heightened to an almost painful degree. She trusted no one. The knock on the door she had been dreading finally came on a humid afternoon, when the sky over Rome was the color of a fresh bruise. It was not the acolyte this time. It was Valerius himself, flanked by his two lictors. He did not wait for her to open the door completely but pushed past her into the small room. His eyes, cold and sharp as chips of flint, took in everything at once. He ignored the official map, beautifully displayed on her main easel. His gaze swept the room, searching. "Your work is slow, Pictor," he said, his voice deceptively mild. "I am told you spend more time in the alleys of the Esquiline than in the halls of the Tabularium. An unusual method for studying the divine. One must understand shadow to appreciate light, Pontifex," Livia said. Her body rigid as she blocked the path to the pigment chest. Valerius's lips curved into a semblance of a smile. It was a terrifying sight. "Ah, the philosopher's defense. My informants tell me you have been consorting with the disgraced Greek, Cassius. A man who believes truth is found by questioning, not by believing. A dangerous friend for an artist in my employ." He took a step closer. "I have come to see your real work, Livia. The work you do when you are not performing for me. The map of shadows." Her heart hammered against her chest. This was it. The end of the line. "I don't know what you mean," she whispered, the lie thin and brittle. Valerius didn't even bother to respond to her denial. He pointed a single, imperious finger at the floor beside the pigment chest. "There," he said to one of the lictors. "A drop of cochineal red. A color reserved for military standards and the cloaks of triumphing generals. A color you have not used once on the Forma Aeterna. Show me why it has stained your floor." The lictor moved forward, his face a blank mask. Livia stood her ground for a moment, a futile, silent act of defiance. Then, she was pushed aside. The lictor kicked the chest, then knelt and lifted the false bottom. He pulled out the massive, rolled-up sheet of vellum. He handed it to Valerius. The Pontifex took the scroll. The room was utterly silent, save for the muffled sounds of the city below and the frantic beating of Livia's own heart. With slow, deliberate movements, Valerius unrolled her map on the large worktable. The Veritas Urbis was revealed. It was breathtaking. It was a masterpiece of cartography, a work of obsessive, brilliant detail. But it was not the Rome of the gods. It was the Rome of mortals, in all its chaotic, sprawling, broken glory. Valerius's eyes widened, first in what looked like artistic appreciation, then in dawning horror. He saw it all. The crooked lanes, the overflowing sewers marked with small, wavy blue lines. The insuli, drawn with such precision that you could see the cracks in their facades. He saw the red ink. A small red cross marking the Mithraeum. A red circle around the fighting pits of the Castra Praetoria. A red line tracing a smuggler's route from the river. He looked up from the map, his face pale with a cold, pure fury. The ideological fury of a man whose entire worldview had just been desecrated. This, he began, his voice a low, trembling whisper of rage. This is not a map. This is a blasphemy. This is a testament to everything that is weak, impure, and transient in this city. You have mapped its diseases, its heresies, its ugliness. You have done this in the name of, what? Truth. I have done this to show what is real, Livia said, finding her voice, which was surprisingly steady. The city is both marble and mud, Pontifex. To deny the mud is to make the marble a lie. The mud is temporary, he snarled. His composure finally breaking. The marble is eternal. The idea of Rome is what matters. It is what holds the world together. Your reality is an invitation to chaos. It is a poison. It whispers to the people that their suffering is the state's fault, that the gods are not perfect, that the emperor is not divine. You have given form to dissent. You have drawn a blueprint for rebellion. He rolled the map up with a violent, final gesture. Your father was a fool who did not understand the nature of power. You, girl, are far more dangerous. You understand it perfectly. And you have chosen to defy it. He turned to the lictors, his face once again a cold, impassive mask of judgment. Seize her. Take this, filth, and burn it. She will be tried by the college for sacrilege. Her sentence is already written. As the guards grabbed her arms, Livia looked not at Valerius, but at her map, clutched in his hand like a condemned prisoner. She had lost. Her truth would be turned to ash. But as they dragged her from the room, she saw a flicker of movement in the courtyard below. A young boy, a neighbor's son whom she sometimes paid to run errands, was watching. He caught her eye for a fraction of a second. It was in that moment that a desperate, wild plan formed in her mind, a final, defiant move in a game she had already lost. Wait, Livia said. Her voice, though not loud, cut through the moment with surprising force, making the lictors pause. Valerius turned, an eyebrow raised in annoyance. You wish to beg, Pictor. It is unbecoming, and useless. No, Pontifex, Livia said, her mind racing, latching onto the one sliver of an opening she could see. I wish to confess. To complete my confession. She forced her eyes to fill with tears, summoning every ounce of theatrical skill she possessed. She looked not at him, but at the precious scroll in his hand. You are right. I have been led astray. By the foolish philosophies of the Greek, by the ghost of my father's pride. This thing, is a heresy. But it is incomplete. Valerius watched her, his expression a mixture of contempt and curiosity. Incomplete? The most dangerous parts, Pontifex. The secrets Cassius gave me. The locations of the secret vaults where the conspirators of the Piso plot hid their gold. The escape tunnels beneath the Domus Aurea. I was afraid to commit them to vellum. I etched them onto clay tablets. They are hidden. It was a complete fabrication, a desperate gamble. And why, Valerius said, his voice dripping with suspicion. Would you reveal this to me now? Because I am a Roman. Livia cried, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. I have sinned against the gods and the emperor, but my final act can be one of service. Let me show you where they are. Let me prove that even in my disgrace, my loyalty to Rome remains. It is my only hope for mercy from the gods, if not from you. For a long moment, Valerius simply stared at her. He was an intelligent man, and he knew he was being played. But the lure of her lie was potent. Secrets of old conspiracies, hidden gold, such knowledge was a powerful weapon in the viper's pit of Roman politics. To be the one who uncovered them would bring immense prestige and favor from the emperor. His ambition warred with his suspicion. "And the map?" he asked, his eyes narrowing. "This map will be destroyed. Your testimony will be recorded. We have no need for you to guide us." "The tablets are coded," Livia lied, the words coming faster now. "It is a cipher known only to me and Cassius. Without me to translate the markings, they are just meaningless scratches on clay." Ambition 1. Valerius gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod. "Very well, Pictor. You will lead us. But know this, if this is a trick, your death will be a slow and very public spectacle. The crows on the Tarpeian rock will feast for a week." He gave an order to one of the lictors, who disappeared down the stairs. The other held Livia's arm in a bruising grip. This was her chance. A tiny, desperate window. As Valerius turned his back to issue another instruction, Livia's eyes darted to the courtyard window. The young boy, Nico, was still there, watching with wide, frightened eyes. She had paid him many times to deliver messages to Cassius, harmless notes about needing more papyrus or a specific pigment. Nico was quick, and he was loyal to the woman who always gave him a sweet honey cake for his troubles. Livia did something she had practiced in her mind 1,000 times, a trick of the trade for signaling a partner across a large construction site. She raised her free hand to her forehead as if in despair, but her fingers were arranged in a specific pattern, a code she and Cassius had devised for emergencies. It meant, the wolf is here. Execute the final plan. Now, Then she let her hand fall. She could only pray Nico had understood. The first lictor returned, this time with a heavy iron chain. As he began to lock it around Livia's wrists, a sudden commotion erupted from the courtyard below. A woman shrieked. A man roared in anger. Then came the unmistakable, terrifying cry, Ignis. Ignis, fire. Everyone in the room froze. Fire was the single greatest terror of life in Rome's crowded tenements. A single spark could consume an entire block in minutes. The second lictor cursed and ran to the window. "Smoke," he yelled. From the cookshop on the ground floor. Panic, swift and absolute, took hold. Valerius's aristocratic composure shattered. He was a man of power, but in the face of a fire in a fourth-floor tinderbox with only one narrow staircase, he was as vulnerable as any plebeian. "We are leaving. Now," he commanded. In the chaos, as the lictor's attention was focused on the exit, as the smell of smoke began to snake into the room, Livia acted. While Valerius was momentarily distracted, his grip on her precious map loosened. With a sudden, desperate wrench of her body, she twisted away from the guard holding her. She lunged for the map, grabbing the scroll from the pontifex's hand. Valerius shouted in rage, but it was too late. Before anyone could react, Livia ran to the open window. Below, the courtyard was now a scene of pandemonium. People were screaming, throwing buckets of water, dragging their belongings into the open. And standing near the edge of the chaos, looking up, was Cassius. Nico stood beside him, pointing. The fire was a diversion. Their diversion. With a final, defiant cry, Livia threw the scroll. It sailed through the smoky air, a pale comet of truth arcing down towards the chaos. For a heart-stopping moment, it seemed it would land in a puddle of filth or be trampled underfoot. But Cassius moved with a speed that belied his age. He caught it, clutching it to his chest like a sacred relic. He gave Livia one last, long look, a look of sorrow, of pride, of farewell. Then he and Nico melted into the terrified crowd and were gone. A hand seized Livia's hair, yanking her back from the window so hard her teeth rattled. Valerius's face was inches from hers, his features contorted into a mask of pure hatred. "You fool," he breathed, his voice shaking with fury. "You condemned yourself for a piece of paper. I will see you flayed for this." He shoved her towards the lictors. Take her. The confession is over. They dragged her out of the workshop, her home, her sanctuary. The smoke on the stairs was thick and choking now, the sounds of panic growing louder. But Livia barely noticed. As they pulled her down the rickety steps and into the street, she looked not at the fire, not at the angry face of the pontifex, but at the spot where Cassius had stood. The map was safe. She had lost her freedom, and she would surely lose her life. But her truth had escaped. In the heart of the eternal city, a place built on glorious, unyielding lies, she had managed to set one small, fragile truth free. And as the iron chains bit into her wrists, she felt a strange, fierce sense of peace. It was the peace of a story completed, of a line perfectly drawn. The trial was a formality, a piece of state theater. In a dark, incense-heavy chamber within the temple complex, Livia stood before the College of Pontiffs, Valerius presiding. He did not mention the map. To do so would be to admit it had existed, and that it had slipped through his fingers. Instead, the charge was simpler, more damning. Sacrilege. Her association with the atheistic philosopher Cassius was presented as proof of her impiety. The sketches of the city's decay were described as malicious libels against the divine order. She did not speak in her own defense. There were no words that could pierce the thick walls of their conviction. Her sentence was read out not with anger, but with a kind of weary gravity, as if she were a diseased limb being regretfully amputated from the body politic. She was to be taken to the Tullianum, the infamous subterranean prison, and there, in the darkness, she would be quietly strangled. A clean, efficient erasure. In the final days, in the cold, damp dark of her cell, she thought of her map. She wondered where it was. She imagined Cassius and Nico, perhaps in a hidden room somewhere in the city, carefully unrolling the vellum. She hoped they would understand its importance. She hoped they would keep it safe. What she did not know was that Cassius had done something far more clever. He knew that a single, large map was a liability, easily found, easily destroyed. Upon returning to his library, he and Nico had spent a frantic night performing a different kind of sacrilege. With a sharp knife, they carefully cut the Veritas Urbis into more than 100 small fragments. Each fragment was a story in itself. One piece showed the Praetorian barracks, another the smugglers' tunnels, another a detailed block of the Subura. Cassius then gave these fragments to trusted friends scattered throughout the city, a Greek merchant, an Egyptian scholar, a Jewish baker, a Syrian astrologer. Each was given a piece of the puzzle, with instructions to hide it, to preserve it. The map was no longer a single object. It had become a diaspora of information, a secret scattered across the very city it depicted, impossible to ever fully recover, but also impossible to completely destroy. On the night of Livia's execution, Cassius sat in his room, holding the last, single fragment of the map. It was the piece that showed Livia's own insula, her small workshop marked with a tiny, precise red dot. He looked at it, his old eyes wet with tears. He had lost his dearest friend's daughter, but he had saved her soul's work. He looked out his window. The whispers on the street had been growing louder in recent weeks. A new superstition from the east, from Judea. It was a strange cult that spoke not of emperors and gods of power, but of a carpenter's son, of humility, of the poor and the meek inheriting the earth. It was a story that celebrated the truth of the common man, the reality of suffering, the importance of a life lived outside the marble halls of power. Most Romans dismissed it as foolishness, another slave religion that would burn itself out. But Cassius, as he looked at the fragment of Livia's map, a map that honored the small, forgotten corners of the world, felt a strange resonance. He didn't know if this new cult would survive. He didn't know if Livia's truth would ever be reassembled. But he knew that the eternal city was more fragile than its rulers believed. It was built on a foundation of secrets and shadows. And sooner or later, whether by a mapmaker's hand or a prophet's word, the truth would find a way to seep through the cracks. The line, once drawn, could never be truly erased. The years that followed Livia's death were a slow, grinding testament to the empire's resilience and its rot. Pontifex Valerius rose even higher in the emperor's favor, his reputation solidified as a vigilant guardian of Roman piety. He oversaw the completion of the Great Archive, and on its polished marble wall, a vast, glorious map of Rome was unveiled. It was a masterpiece of sanitized art, based on Livia's own preliminary sketches but executed by a team of far more obedient, less inquisitive artists. It showed the city as Valerius wished it to be, a perfect, static monument to its own divinity. The crowds marveled at it. The poets wrote odes to it. It was a beautiful, hollow triumph. Valerius never spoke of Livia or her secret map again. In the official records of the College of Pontiffs, her name was listed simply as having been purged for impiety. She was a footnote. An error corrected. He believed he had won, that he had successfully erased her dangerous truth from the world. He was wrong. In a dusty backroom of a spice shop in the Emporium district, a Greek merchant named Theron would sometimes, late at night, unroll a small, strange fragment of vellum. It showed a detailed rendering of the Tiber's docks, but with markings that made no sense to him, red lines indicating which warehouses had lax guards and which officials were susceptible to bribes. He didn't understand what it was, only that his old friend Cassius had pressed it into his hand with a desperate plea to keep it safe. He honored the request, keeping the fragment hidden amongst his shipping ledgers, a piece of a puzzle he would never solve. In a small synagogue in the Transtiberim, a scholar named Shimon kept another piece. His fragment depicted the sprawling, chaotic neighborhood he lived in, but with an accuracy that stunned him. It showed not just the synagogue, but the nearby shrine to Jupiter Dolichinas and the hidden meeting place of an Isis cult, all within a few blocks of each other. It was a map of his neighbors' souls, a picture of the messy, interwoven reality of faith in the city. He saw it not as heresy, but as a profound act of witness. He preserved it within the pages of a sacred scroll. And so it went. Livia's map, her Veritas Urbis, lived on, not as a whole, but as a scattered, secret memory. It became a silent part of the city's living history. A fragment showing the flaws in an aqueduct was used by an engineer to quietly reinforce a weak arch, saving a neighborhood from a potential collapse. A piece detailing the herbalist stalls near the temple of Aesculapius was treasured by a physician, a guide to the city's hidden pharmacies. The map's truth, atomized and dispersed, had been absorbed into the city's bloodstream. It was no longer a single, dangerous document, it was 100 small, useful secrets. Cassius lived for another decade, a frail, stooped figure who watched the slow turning of the imperial wheel. He saw emperors rise and fall. He saw the city burn and be rebuilt. He saw the new Christian cult, once a whispered superstition, grow with a stubborn, weed-like persistence, its message of a different kind of truth appealing to the very people Livia had documented on her map, the ignored, the impoverished, the enslaved. He never tried to reassemble the map. He understood that its power now lay in its fragmentation. To bring it together would be to make it a target once more. Nico, the young boy from the courtyard, grew into a man. He became a stone carver, his hands, like Livia's, becoming tools of memory. He never forgot the look on her face as she threw the scroll, the defiant blaze in her eyes. The story became his personal legend. He eventually took possession of the fragment Cassius had kept, the one showing Livia's workshop. In the corner of a tomb he was carving for a wealthy freedman, he etched a tiny, almost invisible copy of that fragment into the stone. A secret signature, a mapmaker's mark hidden in plain sight. One day, years later, Pontifex Valerius, now an old, powerful man, was overseeing a renovation near the Forum. A section of an old wall was being torn down to make way for a new triumphal arch. As the plaster was stripped away, a hidden cavity was revealed. Inside was a small, clay tablet, covered in what looked like scratches. Valerius, ever the vigilant guardian, took the tablet to be examined. The expert he consulted was a young, brilliant linguist who had made a name for himself deciphering obscure provincial dialects. The linguist studied the tablet for days. Finally, he came to Valerius. "It is a cipher, Pontifex," he explained. "A very clever one, based on Greek philosophical notations. It seems to be a key for a larger work. It speaks of a map, a true map of the city." Valerius went still, the blood draining from his face. The ghost he thought he had buried had returned. The lie Livia had told him in her final moments, the lie about the coded tablets, had, through some bizarre twist of fate, become a kind of truth. He demanded to know what else it said. "It's mostly fragmented," the linguist said, "but it contains a philosophy. It says that a city is not its monuments, but its people. That truth is not a single, polished stone, but a mosaic of 1,000,000 broken pieces. And it ends with a strange prophecy." "Prophesy?" Valerius whispered. "Yes. It says, they build their eternity of marble, but they forget the water that flows beneath. And one day, the water will rise and wash it all away." Valerius dismissed the linguist. His mind reeling. He looked out his window at the city, at the grand temples and arches gleaming in the sun. For the first time in his life, he felt a tremor of doubt. He thought of Livia's map, that sprawling, chaotic masterpiece. He had burned the artist, but he had never managed to burn the art. Her truth, broken and scattered, was still out there, woven into the very fabric of the city he claimed to rule. It was in the reinforced aqueduct, in the physician's knowledge, in the scholar's scroll, in the carver's hidden mark. He had built his career on defending a beautiful, perfect lie. But Livia, the disgraced pictor from the 4th floor of a crumbling insula, had created a truth so resilient that it had outlasted her, a truth that would continue to whisper its secrets long after the marble of his eternal Rome had cracked and turned to dust. The line she had drawn had become a legacy, and the city itself had become her eternal, living map. The final years of Valerius's life were haunted. He, who had walked with emperors and dictated the will of the gods, found himself afraid of whispers, of fragments, of the ghost of a truth he could not excise. He dispatched agents, curiosi, to scour the city for any hint of the scattered map. They searched libraries for unusually accurate scrolls, questioned merchants about strange parchments, and watched the city's artisans for any sign of Livia's distinctive style. They found nothing. Livia's network, built on personal loyalty and quiet respect, was invisible to the eyes of the state. The fragments were too small, too dispersed, too deeply embedded in the daily life of the city to be found. The Pontifex's obsession became a quiet madness. He would walk the city, looking at it with new, paranoid eyes. He saw the cracks Livia had seen. He noticed the graffiti, the poverty, the silent, resentful stares of the common people. He saw the bustling, unregulated life of the docks and the foreign gods worshipped in the tenement basements. He saw the veritas urbis everywhere. Livia had not just mapped the city, she had taught him how to see it, and he hated her for it. His eternal city had been rendered fragile, mortal. His health began to fail. As he lay on his deathbed, in a magnificent villa on the Palatine Hill, surrounded by the finest art and the most attentive physicians, his mind was not on the gods or the afterlife. It was on a small room on the 4th floor of a long-demolished insula, and the defiant eyes of a woman who had chosen to die for a piece of paper. His final words, whispered to a confused senator at his bedside, were, "The water is rising." Rome, of course, did not fall overnight. It was a slow, majestic decline, a process of 1,000 years, not a single event. But the cracks Livia had mapped began to widen. Plagues, carried along the trade routes she had documented, ravaged the population. The economy, strained by endless wars and the corruption she had hinted at, began to buckle. The Praetorian Guard she had so accurately placed on her map became kingmakers and assassins, their barracks the center of countless conspiracies. And the new Christian faith, once a secret marked by a small red cross on her map, grew into a torrent that would eventually overwhelm the old gods and seize the marble temples for its own. Centuries later, during the sack of the city by barbarian hordes, the great archive Valerius had built was looted and burned. The magnificent, idealized map of Rome, the Forma Aeterna, was shattered into a million pieces, its perfect lie lost to history. But Livia's truth endured in its scattered form. A fragment of her map, the one kept by the Greek merchant's descendants, found its way into the hands of a Byzantine military strategist. He used its detailed markings of the Tiber's neglected fortifications to plan a daring, though ultimately futile, defense of the city. Another piece, preserved by the Jewish scholar's family, was copied by a monk in a medieval scriptorium. He marveled at the unknown cartographer's skill, preserving the layout of the ancient Transtiberum district for a future generation of historians. Nico's hidden carving in the tomb remained, undiscovered for centuries, until a Renaissance artist, excavating the ruins for inspiration, found the marker. He did not understand its origin, but he was captivated by the precision and life in the lines, and he incorporated its style into his own celebrated engravings of the Roman ruins. And so her legacy flowed, a hidden river beneath the official history of the world. She was never named, never celebrated. There were no statues raised in her honor. She remained a ghost, an anonymous artist whose work had been deemed a heresy. But her spirit, the spirit of defiant truth-telling, of honoring the small details of human life in the face of overwhelming power, survived. In a distant future, an archaeologist excavating the silted-up ruins of the Roman Forum would find a small, sealed lead scroll case. Inside, preserved from the ravages of time, would be a single, fragile fragment of vellum. It would be the piece Cassius had held on to last. The one showing the Subura district, with a tiny red dot marking the location of a fourth-floor workshop in a long-vanished insula. The archaeologist would use advanced imaging technology to analyze the fragment. She would be astonished by its accuracy, its detail, the life captured in its lines. She would call it an anomaly, a masterpiece by an unknown genius who saw the city with an almost impossibly modern eye. She would write papers about it, speculate on its purpose, and praise the unknown hand that drew it. She would never know the full story of Livia, the pictor with the ink-stained hands. She would never know of the Pontifex, the secret map, or the final, desperate act of defiance at a window overlooking a courtyard on fire. But as she stared at the image of the fragment on her screen, she would feel an undeniable connection. A sense of respect for the artist who, thousands of years before, had looked upon the most powerful city in the world and dared to draw what was real. The line, once drawn, had finally found its way home, a testament not to an eternal empire, but to the even more enduring power of a single, honest human voice. Livia had been erased, but her truth, broken and scattered and whispered through time, had become eternal after all. The rediscovery of Livia's story had a profound and unexpected cultural impact. It moved beyond academia and became a modern parable. A playwright created a sold-out stage production, The Pictor's Hand, that dramatized her confrontation with Valerius. The climax was not a shouting match, but a silent, tense scene where Livia, with charcoal, draws the face of a beggar on the floor of the Pontifex's opulent office, an act of defiance that says more than words ever could. A renowned novelist wrote a fictionalized biography, imagining the thoughts and feelings behind the lines of the map, giving a rich internal life to Livia, Cassius, and even Valerius, portraying him not just as a villain, but as a tragic figure trapped by his own ideology. The book won international acclaim, praised for its deep exploration of the timeless struggle between institutional power and individual integrity. In Rome itself, a new kind of tour began to emerge. It was called the Veritas Urbis Walk. Guides, armed with replicas of Livia's map fragments, would lead small groups away from the grandeur of the Colosseum and the Forum. They would venture into the old neighborhoods, the modern versions of the Subura and Transtiberum, and show people the places Livia had documented. They would point to an ancient wall and say, "Here, Livia recorded the graffiti of a legionary protesting his low pay," or stand by a fountain and explain, "This fountain stands on the site of a hidden shrine to Isis that only appears on Livia's map." She had given the city back its own forgotten stories. Dr. Eris Thorne, in the twilight of her own celebrated career, gave a final, landmark speech. She stood before a vast auditorium, with the digitally reassembled map projected behind her, a sprawling, intricate web of life. "For centuries," she began, her voice resonating with passion, we have understood Rome through the lens of its emperors, its generals, its conquerors. We have studied its power, its laws, its architecture. We have, in essence, been looking at Valerius's map, the Forma Aeterna. We have admired the marble. But Livia, daughter of Marcus, gave us a gift. She gave us the mud. She taught us, Thorne continued, that the true history of a place is not just in its monuments, but in its margins. It is in the forgotten lives, the suppressed stories, the quiet acts of survival and defiance that happen every day. Her map is not just a map of Rome. It is a map of the human condition. It reminds us that truth is not a monument to be worshipped from afar, but a living thing to be sought out, to be documented, and, if necessary, to be defended with our very lives. Livia was erased by her world, she concluded, her eyes sweeping across the rapt audience. They silenced her voice, burned her art, and struck her name from the records. They believed they had won. But they made one fatal error. They underestimated the power of a single, well-drawn line. They forgot that while empires may crumble and marble may turn to dust, a true story, once told, has a way of finding the light. In the final gallery of the great exhibition dedicated to her work, a single spotlight shone on the one, original piece of her map that had been found, the Subura fragment. Beside it, on the wall, was a simple plaque. It did not contain a long academic explanation. It just had her name, her profession, and a quote, taken from the trial transcript, that Valerius had recorded with contempt but which now read as her immortal thesis. The city is both marble and mud. To deny the mud is to make the marble a lie. Livia's map had finally been made whole, not on a single sheet of vellum, but in the shared understanding of humanity. Her lines, drawn in a dusty room under the threat of death, had ultimately proven more resilient than the empire that tried to erase them. Her truth, once broken into 100 pieces, had come together to tell a story that was, in the end, truly eternal. Dynasty. How do you measure the weight of a sister? You don't use scales or stones. You use the currency of years, the slow erosion of your own horizons. You use the quiet shutting of doors on futures you once thought were yours, dreams you fold up and store in the back of your mind like summer clothes in the dead of winter. You measure it in the space she occupies in your heart, a space that is both a cavern of your own lost echoes and a throne upon which your entire world is built. For me, growing up on the 5th floor of Elmwood House, that weight was the first and most absolute truth I ever knew. It was the weight of Anya. Part 1, The Weight of Silence. In the London of 1985, our world was a 2-bedroom council flat in Deptford, a concrete box stacked high in the sky. Its walls, weeping with the persistent misery of a British drizzle, were the borders of our small, fragile nation. We were a trinity of displaced souls, our grandmother, Ba Min, whose spine had long ago curved into a permanent question mark of worry, my little sister, Anya, who was 7 years old and carried a different world behind her eyes, and me, Lena, 12 years old and already a reluctant expert in the cruel geometry of scarcity. The air in our flat was a permanent tapestry of smells, the foundational dampness of old concrete, the sharp, defiant tang of fried garlic, and the ghostly, umami whisper of the fish sauce Ba Min guarded as if it were liquid gold. From our rattling window frame, we saw no winding perfume river from her nostalgic stories. Our vista was the grey, grimy artery of the A2, a river of a different sort, perpetually clotted with the iconic red corpuscles of double-decker buses and the sputtering, exhaust-coughing flotilla of everyday cars. Our life's soundtrack was a symphony of distant sirens, the low rumble of the Docklands light railway being painfully borne from the derelict docks, and the constant, percussive beat of rain against glass, a rhythm of endless melancholy. Existence was a series of meticulous, high-stakes calculations. How many meals could one bag of rice yield if we patted it out with potatoes? How many times could a single PG Tips tea bag be submerged before it surrendered its last ghost of flavor? These were the brutal lessons of the Bao Cap subsidy period in post-war Vietnam, principles of survival that Ba Min had packed along with her few belongings and transplanted into the fertile soil of Thatcher's Britain. The currency was different, pounds and pence instead of dong, but the arithmetic of poverty was a universal language. At the very center of this small, tightly wound universe was Anya. Anya had been born with an extra gentle fold in her chromosomes, a minute deviation in her blueprint that the English doctors, with their clipped, sterile terminology, called Down syndrome. To Ba Min, in the hushed, fearful whispers of her mother tongue, it was a debt from a past life that had followed us across the seas. Engip Chuang. A karmic weight our family was destined to carry. To the gaggle of children who owned the concrete courtyard below, she was simply that weird Chinese girl, an insult that managed to be both cruel and ignorant in equal measure. To me, she was just Anya. My Anya. She was a creature of profound and profounding silence. Her voice was a rare, shy instrument, producing only a soft, melodic humming when she was content, or the occasional, breathy, single-syllable word that belonged to a language of her own invention. But her eyes were vast, dark, bottomless pools that seemed to drink in the world without judgment. She could sit for an entire afternoon on the cracked, worn linoleum of our kitchen floor, tracing the web of fissures with one delicate finger, her gaze filled with an unwavering intensity that felt less like boredom and more like a form of deep, silent prayer. She saw the things the rest of us were too busy to notice. The perfect, fractal geometry in a single cabbage leaf, the iridescent universe of color shimmering in a single oil slick on a rain-filled puddle, the way the low afternoon light would catch the dust motes dancing in a sunbeam, transforming them into a silent, golden ballet for an audience of one. Our neighbors in Elmwood House were a scattered, dissonant orchestra of the cities forgotten and overlooked. There were Irish families who measured their days in pints of Guinness and the recitation of old sorrows, Jamaican grandmothers whose vibrant, defiant laughter was a splash of tropical color in the relentless gray, and the local white working-class families who had been here for generations and looked at us, the newcomers, with a wary, complicated mixture of pity and suspicion. We were the boat people, an exotic tragedy they'd once seen on the 10 o'clock news. Now inconveniently living on their landing. They spoke about Anya in the coded, lowered voices of people discussing a delicate problem when they thought I was out of earshot. "It's a real shame," that is, Mrs. Higgins from number 42 would say to her husband, her cigarette bobbing in time with her pronouncements. "A proper burden on them, especially that older girl. She never gets to be a kid, does she?" A burden. The word was a stone, and they had placed it squarely in my pocket. I felt its cold, smooth weight every morning when I helped Anya with her buttons and shoelaces, her small, pliant limbs a familiar, gentle puzzle. I felt it every afternoon when I held her warm, trusting hand on the walk back from the special school, a beige, single-story building that seemed more focused on containment and routine than on education or discovery. I felt its oppressive heaviness every night when I lay in the small, narrow bed we shared, the mattress sagging between us, listening to the soft, rhythmic puff of her breath. That sound was both my deepest comfort, the assurance she was still here, and the relentless metronome counting out the limitations of my own life. My own dreams were sharp, detailed, and painful in their vividness. I dreamed of soaring library atriums. Of the sacred, hushed quiet of a university lecture hall, of a life measured in the crisp turning of pages and the thrill of new ideas, not in the doling out of potatoes. I devoured books borrowed from the Deptford Public Library, my mind a desperate escape artist, traveling to worlds of history, science, and poetry that my body could never reach. But the dreams always dissolved in the same way, with the sensation of a soft tug on my sleeve. Anya's small hand pulling me back from the precipice of my imagination, back to the concrete reality of the 5th floor. The moment the stone in my pocket became a crushing, unbearable weight, the moment my childhood truly ended, happened in the bleak, sodden heart of a November winter. Anya developed a cough. At first, it was just a small, dry rasp, almost an affectation. But within a few days, it deepened into something ragged and wet. A terrible sound that seemed to tear at the delicate, precious fabric of her lungs. Her small chest began to heave with the sheer effort of each breath, and a faint, terrifying bluish tint started to ghost her lips and nail beds. A fever took hold, leaving her skin slick with a clammy sweat while her body shivered with a deep, internal cold that no blanket could warm. Ba Min, falling back on the certainties of her homeland. tried her remedies first. She boiled strange, gnarled roots and dried herbs that filled the small flat with a bitter, earthy steam. She rubbed Anya's chest with tiger balm until the air stung my eyes with camphor and menthol. But the fever only climbed, a relentless, invisible enemy. "We have to see the doctor, Ba," I insisted, my voice tight with a fear that tasted like old pennies. Ba Min wrung her thin, wrinkled hands. "The English doctors, they are cold, Lena. They don't understand our bodies, our heat, our balance." "She can't breathe," I whispered, the words barely making it past the lump of panic in my throat. "Listen to her." The local GP surgery was a cramped, beige waiting room that smelled of stale air, cheap antiseptic, and quiet, simmering despair. We waited for 2 hours, surrounded by the wet, hacking coughs and weary sighs of other patients. Anya lay listless and heavy in my arms, her head a dead weight against my shoulder, her usually bright eyes dull and clouded. When our name was finally called, we were ushered into the presence of Dr. Evans. He looked at us over the top of his half-moon spectacles, his face a mask of profound, bone-deep weariness. He was a man drowning in the endless tide of minor ailments and major depressions from an entire estate. And we were just one more anonymous drop in that overwhelming ocean. He pressed a cold stethoscope to Anya's chest, listened for a perfunctory moment, and let out a long, tired sigh. "It's a chest infection. Very common this time of year." "But she can't breathe properly," I pleaded, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to sound mature and credible. "And her lips, they're going blue sometimes. Children with her condition, they often have weaker constitutions," he said. The word condition, a clumsy, sterile tool he used to keep us, and our messy reality, at a safe, professional distance. He scribbled a prescription for pink amoxicillin syrup on an NHS pad. "Give her 5 milliliters of this twice a day. Keep her warm. Plenty of fluids. She'll be fine." He was already reaching for the next patient file on his desk, his gaze shifting past us. We were dismissed. A problem diagnosed and solved in under 4 minutes. That night was the longest and most terrifying of my young life. The pink, sweet-smelling medicine did nothing. Anya's breathing grew shallower, a desperate, frantic battle for air. Each tiny, rasping gasp was a white flag of surrender waved by her failing lungs. I sat bolt upright by our bed, the world shrunk to the space of that single mattress, holding a damp cloth to her burning forehead, my own breath hitched in my throat, unconsciously mirroring her struggle. In the living room, Ba Min had retreated into a corner, her lips moving in a silent, frantic chain of prayers to ancestors and deities who felt a million miles away across the cold, dark sea. The doctor's clinical, dismissive words echoed in my head, a cruel counterpoint to the sound of my sister's suffering. Asterisk weaker constitution. She'll be fine, asterisk it was the casual, unthinking indifference that shattered me. We were not a priority. Anya's fight for life was a footnote in his busy day, a statistical probability. In that long, dark night, I understood with a cold, terrifying clarity that we were utterly, irrevocably alone. The system, the famous British safety net I had read about with such reverence in my school citizenship classes, was riddled with holes, and our small family had just fallen clean through. I was no longer a 12-year-old girl who loved books. I was a guardian. A defender. I was Anya's only wall against a world that did not have the time, or the inclination, to care. That night, I closed the door on the dreaming girl I had been, and became the watcher. And the weight of that silence, the profound silence of my sister's struggle and the deafening silence of the world's indifference, settled deep into my bones. A cold, heavy ballast I would carry forever. Kant. Part 2, The Language of Paper. The next 5 years passed in a blur of muted colors, a watercolor painting left out in the London rain. Time didn't march forward with purpose, it seeped, like the persistent damp in our kitchen walls, staining everything with a sense of weary permanence. By 1990, I was 17, a young woman sculpted not by the carefree joys of adolescence but by the dense, unyielding gravity of responsibility. The girl who had dreamed of Oxbridge libraries, of losing herself in the hushed, sacred quiet of ancient lecture halls, now stacked tabloid newspapers and boxes of Cadbury's chocolate at a corner newsagent. The cloying smell of cheap print and stale sugar clung to my clothes and hair, a constant, unwelcome reminder of my shrunken world. My A-levels had become a distant, painful memory, like a phantom limb that ached with the memory of what it could do. I'd done well, of course. My mind was still a hungry, restless thing. But when the thick, promising envelopes of the UCAS forms had arrived, I had sat at our small kitchen table, tracing the university crests with my finger, King's College, UCL, Cambridge. Then I had looked over at Anya, asleep in our bed, her small form a picture of perfect, fragile peace, and I had quietly, methodically, torn the forms into small, neat squares and dropped them into the bin. There was no one to explain this choice to, no grand, dramatic scene. It was a simple, brutal equation. The money I could earn by working full-time was a necessity, my education was a luxury. And on the 5th floor of Elmwood House, there was no room for luxuries. Anya, now 12, had grown into her silence. It was no longer a passive absence of words but an active, deeply observant state. She still attended the special school, a low, brick building that I'd come to despise with a quiet, burning intensity. They taught her to thread oversized wooden beads and sort colored plastic blocks into matching buckets. They were tasks designed to keep her hands busy but her mind tethered and still. In their well-meaning, systematic way, they saw the label, Down syndrome, and they stopped looking for the person. They did not see, or perhaps chose not to see, the way she watched the world, the fierce, burning intelligence that lived in the dark, quiet pools of her eyes. They saw limitations to be managed, not a mind to be reached. My resentment was a secret I kept locked in the deepest, most fortified part of myself. It was a bitter, acidic thing that would bubble up at the most inconvenient of times, scalding me with its truth. I'd feel its familiar sting when I saw girls my own age laughing on their way to college, their futures stretching before them like an open, sunlit road while mine was a cul-de-sac. I'd feel it when I handed over my meager wage packet to bum in for the rent and the electricity meter, my own small dreams deferred for another week. Another month, another year. The guilt that followed this resentment was immediate and suffocating, a thick blanket that smothered the anger. How could I resent the sister I loved more than my own life? Her existence was not a cage, I would tell myself fiercely, repeating it like a mantra. It was the four walls of home. It was a lie, and in the quiet of the night, listening to her breathe, I knew it. And Anya knew. She couldn't have understood the abstract concepts of university applications or wage packets, but she was a master of emotional weather, a human barometer. She could read the subtle shifts in the atmosphere of our flat with unnerving accuracy. She could detect the tension in my shoulders as I washed the dishes, the forced, brittle brightness in my smile when I came home from a long shift. On my worst days, when the bitterness was a taste at the back of my throat, she would approach me quietly, without a word, and take my hand in hers. Her own was always small and warm, and she would just hold it, her gaze fixed on our joined hands as if they were the most fascinating and important object in the world. She never looked at my face in those moments, as if she knew the mask I wore was too fragile to be witnessed. And in the silent, unconditional acceptance of that small gesture, the resentment would melt away, leaving only a raw, aching, overwhelming love. It was during this time, in the space created by our shared, unspoken understanding, that she began to speak her true language. It began with a piece of charcoal, a small, blackened lump she had salvaged from the remnants of a neighbor's discarded barbecue in the muddy patch of grass below our block. I came home from work one damp afternoon, my feet aching, my soul weary, and found her on the floor of our bedroom. Her back was to me, and she was utterly, completely absorbed, a small priestess performing a sacred rite. On a large, ripped piece of cardboard from a cereal box, she was drawing. It wasn't the clumsy, stick figure art of a typical child. It was a mesmerizing, intricate pattern of interlocking spirals and sharp, geometric shapes, a controlled, deliberate storm of black lines on a brown background. I stared, my weariness forgotten, and I realized with a sudden jolt what it was. It was a perfect visual representation of the swirling, chaotic mess of the traffic on the A2 during rush hour, but she had rendered it as something beautiful, something ordered, something hypnotic. It was her voice. It was her mind. Finally, miraculously, made visible. From that day forward, paper became our most precious commodity, more valuable than tea or sugar. I became a scavenger. I brought home the long, curling ends of till rolls from the newsagent, the smooth, blank backs of outdated promotional posters, the brown paper bags from the fruit and veg stall on the high street. Our small flat, already cramped with 3 lives, began to fill with her expanding world. Her art was everywhere. She drew the complex web of cracks in the pavement outside, transforming them into the branching deltas of a mighty river. She drew the flock of pigeons that gathered on our windowsill, capturing not their physical form but the frantic, fluttering, explosive energy of their wings. She drew Bamin's wrinkled hands as she peeled potatoes. Each line on the page a story, each dark penciled knuckle a repository of memory and hardship. Her art was our secret, a sacred pact between us. We kept the drawings stacked carefully under the bed we shared, a hidden library of her soul. To show them to anyone else felt like a profound betrayal, a violation. How could I possibly explain to the outside world that these were not just nice drawings? That this was my sister's way of saying, I am here. I see this. I think this. I feel this, the world had denied her a conventional voice, so she had painstakingly, brilliantly, created one from charcoal and ink and scrap paper, a language more articulate and more profound than any I could ever hope to speak. Meanwhile, London itself was changing around us, morphing into something new. The grey, austere monolith of Canary Wharf clawed its way into the sky. A monument to a new kind of money that had nothing to do with us. The airwaves, once dominated by the mournful synth-pop of the 80s, now buzzed with the new, swaggering sounds of Oasis and Blur. The city was shedding its drab, post-war skin and emerging, blinking, into the neon glow and performative optimism of the 90s. This new, confident, cool Britannia felt a universe away from our fifth-floor existence. We watched it on our small, flickering television, this world of pop stars and fashion models and politicians talking about a new Britain, but it didn't belong to us. It was a party we hadn't been invited to, and its cheerful noise only served to highlight the drab, silent reality of our own lives. But within our flat, another, quieter transformation was taking place. Bamin was changing. The years, and Anya's undeniable presence, had softened the sharp, fearful edges of her beliefs. The concept of Angip Chuang, of karmic debt, was slowly, painstakingly being replaced by a simple, fierce, unconditional pride. She would watch Anya draw for hours, her head tilted, a look of quiet wonder on her face. The shame she had once carried like a hidden weight had been burned away by the undeniable, brilliant evidence of her granddaughter's unique gift. She had stopped trying to understand why Anya was the way she was, and had simply started to see who she was. One evening, just before Christmas, Mrs. Higgins from number 42 knocked on our door. She held a plate of slightly burnt mince pies, her yearly offering of neighborly goodwill. As Bamin was at the doorway, making polite conversation, a sudden gust of wind from the open kitchen window blew one of Anya's most recent drawings off the table. It was a large piece, done on the back of a discarded calendar. It was a portrait of Elmwood House itself, but drawn not as a grim, brutalist concrete slab, but as a towering, fantastical, living tree. Each window was a glowing, luminous leaf. Each satellite dish was a strange, metallic flower. Each crack in the facade was the bark of an ancient trunk. It was our home, seen through her eyes, and it was beautiful. Mrs. Higgins, ever practical, bent down and picked it up before it could flutter down the stairwell. She stared at it, her mouth, usually set in a grim line, slightly agape. The mince pie plate tilted precariously in her other hand. Did your little one do this?" she asked, her usual gruff, no-nonsense voice softened with genuine surprise. I held my breath. I expected Min to be embarrassed, to brush it off. But she stood up a little straighter. Her voice, when she spoke, was clear and strong, without a single trace of shame or apology. "Yes," she said, looking Mrs. Higgins directly in the eye. "My granddaughter, Anya. She is an artist." It was the first time I had ever heard her use that word. An artist. Not a burden, not a condition, not a karmic debt. An artist. In that small, drafty hallway, under the flickering, humming fluorescent light, I felt a tectonic shift in the foundations of our world. It wasn't just Min who had said it. It was as if our small, isolated family had finally found the right word, the true word, to define ourselves against the world's clumsy, hurtful labels. That night, as I carefully placed the drawing of the treehouse back into the growing stack under our bed, I saw them all differently. They were not a secret to be hidden away in shame. They were a testimony. A chronicle. A language waiting for a translator. And I realized, with a sudden, startling clarity that was both a weight and a liberation, that my purpose in life was not just to be Anya's protector, her wall against the world. It was to become her interpreter. The weight I carried was not a burden of silence. It was the profound, humbling privilege of being the sole keeper of 100 silent, beautiful stories, and it was my duty to learn how to read them to the world. Kant. Part 3, The Price of a Voice. The 90s bled into the new millennium with a frantic, pop-fueled energy. Tony Blair was in Downing Street, promising a new dawn. The Millennium Dome, a colossal white elephant, had risen and settled on the Greenwich Peninsula. A monument to a nationwide hangover of forced optimism. London felt like a city plugged into a new, frantic electrical socket, humming with money and possibility. For us, however, life on the 5th floor of Elmwood House still moved at Anya's pace, quiet, deliberate, and utterly divorced from the frantic rhythm of the city below. By the late 1990s, I was a young woman in my early 20s, the years having sanded away my youthful softness, leaving behind a certain pragmatic resilience. Anya was a teenager, her body changed, but her essential nature, her profound and watchful stillness, remained the same. Her art had become her entire world, and by extension, mine. The newsagent job had long been replaced by a position as an early morning cleaner in a gleaming glass and steel office block in the city. The hours were brutal, the work anonymous and invisible. But the pay was better. Every extra pound was a small, hard-won victory, a tiny chip in the monolithic mountain of our precarity. Over a decade of scrimping and saving, of walking instead of taking the bus, of mending clothes until they were more patched than fabric, I had managed to build a small, secret nest egg. It was my one-day fund. One day, I would whisper to myself in the dark, I will take a business course. One day, I will open a small cafe, a place that smells of coffee and fresh bread, not damp and bleach. One day, I will have a life that isn't entirely defined by the geography of this 5th-floor flat. It was a modest dream, a postage stamp-sized ambition, but it was mine. A little over £3,000, saved in worn 5- and 10-pound notes, rolled up and hidden in an old shortbread biscuit tin at the back of my wardrobe. It was the tangible, paper and metal price of my future. The catalyst for change, when it came, arrived not in the form of a doctor or a social worker, but as a man who smelled of expensive cologne and damp, fine wool. He was a French cultural attaché named Jean-Pierre Dubois, and he was visiting our estate as part of a terribly earnest and utterly clueless, cross-channel initiative on the transformative power of urban community art. I saw them from our kitchen window, Dubois and a flustered local councillor, 2 men in smart, dark coats looking profoundly out of place, like penguins at a pigeon fight. It happened, as all pivotal moments in our life seem to, by the grace of a sudden, mischievous gust of London wind. Anya was sitting on our small, caged-in balcony, drawing. The wind, whipping around the corner of the block, snatched the large piece of cardboard she was working on right out of her hands. It was a swirling, dynamic vortex of blue and purple felt-tip pen, a stunning portrait of the turbulent sky as seen between the oppressive concrete lines of the council blocks. It cartwheeled through the air, a flash of defiant color against the grey sky, and landed directly at the feet of Monsieur Dubois. He bent down and picked it up. He tilted his head, his expression quizzical. He looked up, trying to discern its origin among the identical rows of windows. The counselor, mortified, tried to steer him away. "Just some rubbish, I expect, blowing about." But Dubois ignored him. He was staring at the drawing with an expression I recognized instantly. It was the same look of stunned, silent wonder I had seen on Mrs. Higgins' face all those years ago. He saw it. He truly saw it. He looked up again, his gaze scanning the floors, and for a brief, electric moment, his eyes met mine. That single, fleeting glance led to a chain of events that felt like something from a different, more hopeful reality. Monsieur Dubois was persistent. He returned the next day, alone. He navigated the urine-scented lift and knocked on our door. He spoke to us in careful, respectful English, his soft French accent making the words sound kinder, less clinical than we were used to. He didn't talk about Anya's condition or her disability. He talked about her vision, her unique artistic perspective, her extraordinary use of color. With our hesitant permission, he looked through her stacks of drawings, handling each piece of cardboard and scrap paper with the gentle reverence of a museum curator handling priceless manuscripts. And then he made a phone call. He was a patron, he explained, of a small medical charity that worked with artists and their families, one that specialized in helping children with congenital conditions that were often overlooked by mainstream healthcare. He arranged for a specialist, a leading cardiologist named Dr. Aris who consulted for the charity, to visit us. Dr. Elena Aris was the polar opposite of the weary, dismissive Dr. Evans from our shared, traumatic memory. She was warm, vibrant, and her smile seemed to reach her eyes. When she entered our flat, she knelt down to speak to Anya directly, not over her head. She admired the drawings taped to the walls, telling Anya she had a remarkable eye. She used a portable ultrasound machine, a piece of sleek, modern technology that looked like a prop from science fiction in the cramped, worn surroundings of our living room. As she moved the probe over Anya's chest, we all watched the flickering black and white image on the small screen, a frantic, pulsing picture of my sister's own hidden world. The diagnosis, when it came, was delivered with gentle, devastating precision. Anya has an atrioventricular septal defect, Dr. Aris explained, pointing to the screen. It's essentially a hole in the center of her heart. It means that oxygenated and deoxygenated blood are mixing. It's the reason for her breathlessness, her low energy, why she was so susceptible to those chest infections as a child. She looked at me, her gaze full of understanding. It is a very common condition in children with Down syndrome. Then she smiled. The good news is that it is correctable. The surgery to repair it has a very high success rate. It would be life-changing for her. It would give her so much more energy, protect her from serious heart complications in the future. Hope, sharp, brilliant, and terrifying, pierced through the dull fog of my resignation. For a moment, I allowed myself to see a new future for Anya, a future where she wasn't so fragile, a future where she could run, could laugh without gasping for breath. Then came the inevitable reality. The practicalities. The numbers. The charity, thanks to Monsieur Dubois's influence, would cover the cost of the complex surgery itself. It was an astonishingly generous, lottery-winning offer. But, Dr. Aris explained gently, the NHS waiting list for the battery of preliminary tests, scans, and specialist consultations required before surgery was over a year long. For a teenager with a deteriorating condition, it was a dangerously long time. To have it all done privately, to get her ready for the surgery within a few months while the surgical team was available, would incur significant costs. The pre-op consultations, the MRI scans, the post-operative physiotherapy. There were 100 hidden expenses not covered by the charity's grant. She gave us the final estimate, a neat, clinical figure on her notepad. £3,200. The number hung in the air of our small living room, a perfect, brutal, devastating match for the contents of my shortbread biscuit tin. It was the exact price of my future. That night, the flat was thick with a tense, suffocating silence we hadn't felt in years. Ba-min sat at the kitchen table, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. Her face was a mask of conflict. She saw the hand of fate, a cruel, impossible test. "It is too much, Lena," she finally whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the old refrigerator. "We cannot. It is a sign. We have managed this long." "We can," I said. My voice hard, brittle. "I have the money." "Your money," she corrected me, her gaze filled with a profound sadness. "Money for your life. For your cafe. You have given enough of your life already. Anya, she is happy as she is. She doesn't know any different. She is not happy." The words tore out of me, louder and harsher than I intended. "She is trapped. She can't run, she can't play, she gets tired walking to the shop. We can help her, Ba. We can give her a chance to be stronger, to live a longer life. Doesn't she deserve that?" "And what do you deserve?" she shot back, her voice for once laced not with superstition, but with a fierce, protective love for me. "To be a cleaner for the rest of your life? To have nothing that is just for you? You are also my granddaughter. Your life matters too." The argument raged. A quiet, desperate storm in the tiny teacup of our flat. But the real war, the real brutal conflict, was being waged inside me. It was a war between two loves, two futures, two non-negotiable truths. There was the dream of my cafe, a small, sunlit space that was wholly mine, a life where I wasn't just Anya's sister, but just Lena. And then there was the dream of hearing Anya take a deep, clear, effortless breath. It felt like an impossible, monstrous choice. The 17-year-old girl I had been, the one who had torn up the university forms, had made her sacrifice out of a sense of grim, youthful necessity. This was different. This was a conscious choice, laid bare on the kitchen table. I could say no. I could keep my money and my dream, and we would go on the NHS waiting list, and wait, and hope, and manage as we always had. No one, not even Ba-min, would truly blame me. I couldn't sleep that night. The flat felt like it was closing in on me. I slipped out of bed and went to the wardrobe, pulling out the old biscuit tin. I sat on the floor and emptied the contents, the rolled-up notes and heavy coins forming a small, pathetic mountain on the carpet. A decade of my life, right there. Then I went to the space under our bed and pulled out the stacks and stacks of Anya's drawings. I laid them out on the floor of our small living room, arranging them chronologically. It was a mosaic of her soul, a timeline of her silent life. I saw the early, frantic charcoal swirls of the traffic. I saw the tender portraits of Ba-min's hands. I saw the fantastical tree our building had become. I saw her most recent works, bursting with a color and complexity that was breathtaking. This was her life's work. This was her voice. It was as real, as valid, as tangible as any business plan, any university degree. Her future was not a lesser future. It was just a different one. My dream, my little cafe, was about building a small, safe, beautiful space for myself. A place of escape. But what if the greatest, most beautiful thing I could ever build was a stronger, healthier future for her, right here? What if my purpose wasn't to escape the 5th floor, but to fortify it, to make it the strongest, safest place it could be for the person I loved more than anyone on earth? The conflict inside me didn't resolve with a thunderclap of revelation. It simply faded away into a quiet, simple, absolute clarity. There was no choice. Looking at the vibrant, brilliant world she had created on paper, a world of such beauty and vision, I knew there had never really been a choice. There was only Anya. I gathered the money back into the tin. I walked back into the living room, where Ba-min was still sitting in the dark, a silent silhouette against the orange glow of the city. I knelt before her, as I had as a small child, and took her hands in mine. "We will do it," I said, my voice steady and clear, free of doubt for the first time in what felt like forever. "I will pay for it. It's not my money, or her money. It's our money. It's for our family." In the dim light from the street lamp outside, I saw a single, glistening tear trace a path down the wrinkled, intricate map of her cheek. She nodded, a small, slow, final gesture of surrender and acceptance. It was the price of a voice, the cost of a future. And we would pay it together. Kant. Part 4, The Courtyard Exhibition. The surgery itself was a surreal journey into a different London. A parallel universe that existed behind the smoked glass doors of a private hospital near Regent's Park. This was a world of hushed, carpeted corridors, the scent of fresh flowers instead of antiseptic, and the low, reassuring tones of doctors and nurses who had time to spare. It was a world paid for by a decade of scrubbing floors in the dead of night and stacking shelves under flickering fluorescent lights. The irony was a bitter pill. I watched them wheel a small, trusting Anya, dressed in a gown far too big for her, into the sterile sanctuary of the operating theater. For 6 long, agonizing hours, I sat in a plush waiting room chair that felt like a sensory deprivation tank, the silence of the room broken only by the frantic, thundering drumbeat of my own heart. The world outside, with its traffic and its noise, ceased to exist. My entire universe was in that operating room, held in the skilled hands of strangers. When Dr. Eris finally emerged, her blue scrubs looking pale under the soft lighting, her mask down, the smile on her face was the sunrise I had been waiting for my entire life. "She did beautifully," she said, her voice warm with genuine pleasure. "A textbook success. The repair is perfect. She's a strong little fighter." The change in Anya over the next few days was not a sudden, magical transformation, but a slow, profound blossoming. It was like watching a time-lapse film of a flower that has been starved of water finally being given a deep, life-giving drink. A healthy, rosy flush returned to her cheeks and lips, chasing away the faint, bluish shadow that had always haunted them. Her energy, a resource she had always conserved with the careful parsimony of a miser, began to bubble up. Soft and tentative at first, then with a growing confidence. Her breath, which had always been a quiet, shallow struggle, was now a deep, easy, even rhythm. The first time I heard her truly laugh, a real, chest-deep, uninhibited giggle at a cartoon mouse on the hospital television, the sound was so unexpected, so pure and beautiful, it broke something open inside me. I had to turn away so she wouldn't see the tears streaming down my face. It was the sound of a life unburdened. We returned to Elmwood House, back to our 5th-floor world, but something had fundamentally shifted. The oppressive weight of constant, low-level worry that had been our 4th family member was gone. The very air in the flat felt lighter, cleaner. We had faced the dragon and, against all odds, we had won. My first act after paying the last of the hospital bills, my biscuit tin now heartbreakingly light, was to walk into an art supply shop on the high street. It was a place I had only ever looked at through the window, a magical cave of possibility. I breathed in the intoxicating smell of turpentine, linseed oil, and fresh paper. With the money I had left, I bought her proper materials. A pad of thick, textured A3 paper. A box of rich, vibrant oil pastels that felt buttery to the touch. A set of real artists' charcoal sticks in varying thicknesses. Watching her with these new tools was like watching someone who has been whispering their whole life finally learn how to sing in full voice. The colors she produced were electric, the lines confident and bold. She filled our small flat with her visions, transforming our cramped, worn home into a dazzling, chaotic, beautiful studio. Her art was no longer just a secret language. It was a joyous declaration. The idea came to me one afternoon as I watched her, her brow furrowed in concentration, her hands a blur of color. Her art was too powerful, too full of life, to be hidden under a bed or confined to our walls. It was a voice that deserved an audience. We weren't going to try and sell it. That felt wrong, profane, like putting a price on her soul. We were going to show it. We were going to give it away. We didn't have a gallery. We had something better. We had the courtyard. With Ba Min's surprising and enthusiastic help, we began to plan. My grandmother, who had once hidden Anya away from the prying eyes of the community, was now her most passionate curator. We went to second-hand shops and bought a dozen cheap, mismatched wooden frames. We spent a whole weekend carefully mounting her best pieces, turning flimsy cardboard and paper into works of art. I wrote out small, neat labels for each one on index cards: pigeon flight at dawn, bus route number 47, rain on the kitchen window, grandmother's hands peeling ginger. I made a simple, hand-drawn poster, using Anya's own vibrant felt-tip pens, and stuck it to the glass door of the community hall at the base of our block. It read, "The Colors of Elmwood House. An exhibition of art by Anya Nguyen. One day only." The day of the exhibition was bright, crisp, and clear, a rare, perfect gift from the London autumn sky. We borrowed 3 long trestle tables from the community hall and set up her work around the drab concrete courtyard. We leaned larger pieces against the brick walls and, with clothes pegs, hung a dozen more from the communal washing lines, where they fluttered in the gentle breeze like colorful, story-filled prayer flags. For one afternoon, the gray, utilitarian space was transformed into a kaleidoscope of color and raw, unfiltered emotion. I didn't know if anyone would come. I stood there, my stomach a knot of nervous butterflies, holding Anya's hand. She was preternaturally calm, her eyes taking in her own work, displayed for all the world to see, with a quiet, solemn satisfaction. This was her kingdom. At first, it was just a trickle. Mrs. Higgins from number 42, her curiosity piqued by the unusual activity. She walked slowly from piece to piece, her customary cigarette unlit and forgotten in her hand, her face a picture of stunned silence. "My word," she kept muttering to herself, her voice husky. "Well, I'll be. My word." Then others came, drawn out by the color and the quiet buzz. The Jamaican grandmothers, who nodded their heads slowly, murmuring, "Powerful, child, powerful." The Irish fathers, who stood silently with their arms crossed, looking at a drawing of the local pub rendered as a warm, glowing lantern. The children Anya had grown up alongside but never really with. They moved through the makeshift gallery, their usual boisterous, chaotic energy replaced by a hushed curiosity. They were seeing their world. Our world, for the first time through Anya's eyes. The ugly concrete of Elmwood House was a fantastical, living tree. The noisy, dirty traffic on the A2 was a flowing river of light and energy. The mundane had been made magical. They weren't just looking at pictures. For the first time, they were looking at Anya. They saw the girl they had only ever known as the quiet one, the slow one, the poorly one, and they were seeing the fierce, complex, beautiful mind behind the silence. The whispers that rustled through the small crowd were different now. They weren't the whispers of pity or suspicion I had grown up hearing. They were whispers of awe. I watched as a young boy named Kevin, one who used to be the ringleader of the children who mocked her, stood transfixed before a drawing of a simple spider's web, which Anya had rendered in shimmering silver pen on black paper. Each thread a perfect, luminous miracle. He turned to his friend. "Wow," he said, his voice stripped of its usual bravado. "She can really draw." It was such a small sentence. Such a simple, childish observation. But to me, hearing it, it was a symphony. It was acceptance. It was respect. He didn't say, "She can draw well for someone like her." He just said, "She can draw." In that moment, the label had fallen away. And only the person and her talent remained. As the sun began to dip below the rooftops, casting long, golden shadows across the courtyard, our little exhibition wound down. We didn't sell a single piece. No art critics came. We didn't become famous. But as we began to carefully take down the drawings, I knew we had achieved something far more valuable. We had changed the emotional geography of our own small world. Anya was no longer an island of our family's making. She was a landmark. Her silence was no longer an absence to be filled with pity, but a language that our community, in their own quiet, astonished way, was finally beginning to learn. Later that evening, the three of us sat on our small balcony. The cool night air was filled with the familiar sounds of the city. We were looking out over the now empty courtyard, the space still humming with the ghost of the afternoon's magic. Anya was leaning against me, her breathing deep and even, her hands relaxed in her lap for once. She was sketching in a new pad with a soft pencil, her movements fluid and peaceful. Ba-Min sat beside us, sipping a small cup of jasmine tea, her face, illuminated by the orange glow from the streetlights below, completely serene. The weight of my sister was still there. It would always be there. But it had transformed. It was no longer the crushing weight of a burden, or the sharp, sacrificial weight of a choice. It was the anchoring weight of a shared history, the comforting weight of a hand I knew would always be in mine, the beautiful, life-affirming weight of a soul I had fought to protect, a soul that had, in turn, saved mine from a life of bitter resentment. She had taught me that a life is not measured in achievements or spoken words, in degrees or business plans. It is measured in the capacity to love, in the courage to see the world differently, and in the silent, vibrant, unapologetic beauty of a single, honest brushstroke. And looking at her, my sister, my artist, my Anya, I knew it was more than enough.